I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Francisco, Hart, here. Hotchkiss, here. Murillo,
here.
Rouse, White, Mayor Snyder.
Here. Item 1.
Employee Recognition Service Award pins.
Mr. Casey.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, council members. Each month we'd like to recognize city employees for achieving milestones with work for their city. So I'd like to read a number of their names into the record for recognition and to thank them for their years of service with the city. With 5 years of service, Kyle Crooks, a police officer with the police department. Sarah Fox, records technician, administrative services department. Julio Gonzalez Vasquez, water district operator 2, public works department. Jesus Jaimes, senior water district operator, public works department. David Rowell, project planner, community development department. Andrew Ruiz, wastewater treatment plant operator 2, public works department. And Ramon Urrutia, wastewater collection systems operator 2, public works department. With 10 years of service to the city, Heather Clark, police officer with the police department. Casey Corbett, 10 years, police officer, police department. Brian Miller, police officer with the police department. Moises Tinajera, senior water district operator, public works department. And Matthew Tonello, police officer with the police department. With 15 years of service, Martin Goloszewski, waterfront maintenance worker 2, waterfront department. Cam Sanchez, police chief with the police department. And Ignacio Valdez, grounds maintenance crew leader, Parks and Recreation Department. And with 25 years of service, Myrna Dubun, administrative specialist with the police department.
Well, congratulations to them all. We don't have any pins today, but we want to extend our thanks and their congratulations. Public comment. I have a number of speaker slips here. I'm just going to take the prerogative first just to congratulate Kathy Murillo and Randy Rouse on a successful re-election, and we'll have a more formal ceremony in January, but good work, and that's why we weren't here last week. We're a little busy. So we'll start with Andrea Roslinski, be followed by Phil Walker.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and Kathy. Congratulations, Randy. I just wanted to have a little update because I haven't been here for a while. I think last time I was here was when it was a year anniversary of Robin Williams' death, and the mayor kind of shut me up after my 2 minutes. So I was going to say he was great. He was a great, great entertainer and improv and everything, actor. But what he loved the most was, I think he got the most joy out of entertaining the vets, and Veterans Day's tomorrow, so I wanted to remember that. And then I haven't been here, so sometimes I listen, and I don't know if you ever solved the mystery. I think I might have, if the mystery of those racks in front of the post office, because for like a year, I think in 76 or 77, I lived in Isla Vista, and there was some type of thing kind of called the bike station where we left like 6 bikes, or four to six bikes, near near State and the 154, a few bikes by the post office, and a few bikes in Isla Vista out by UCSB. And it was on an honor system, but you could check out bikes and people would bring them back if they needed them. And I don't know if that might have been a place where people used to hook up bikes. And what else? Oh, yeah, there was something I wanted to read. Now I hope I can find it if I have more time, because I probably should have. Oh, no. Well, it was a poem or something me and my friends wrote a long time ago in Topanga, but I should have been more prepared. Oh, here it is. I don't know how many more minutes I have. So I guess next time. Okay, here it is. Hugging. Hugging is healthy and it helps your body's immune system. Keeps you healthy, cures depression, reduces stress, is invigorating, is rejuvenating, has no unpleasant side effects, and hugging is nothing less than a miracle drug. Hugging is all natural, it's organic, naturally sweet, no pesticides, no preservatives, no artificial ingredients, and 100% wholesome. Hugging is practically the perfect. There are no movable parts, batteries to wear out, no periodic checkups, low energy consumption, no insurance required, theft-proof, non-taxable, non-polluting, and, of course, fully returnable.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a great day,
You
everybody.
dropped something on the floor there, Andrea. There you go.
All right, have a great day.
Phil Walker will be followed by Fred Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. Dr. Weber's loss is your gain today. I was sitting in the dentist's office, and he just did not have time. City Administrator Casey asked me what I think. Is it going to rain? And we got a couple of sprinkles or spritzes last night, or earlier yesterday and last night, but what I'm starting to see, I have serious doubts. And the way you follow the jet stream map, the CRWS, and the near-shore, offshore ocean temps are falling like a rock, so we'll see. So what the City Resources, Water Resources Division has done, especially Josh Hagmark driving it, we're very fortunate to have the capability coming on board the desal plant. A couple other quick things. The soft story retrofit program is probably a lot of the council knows is they've tripped the wire on that, the 7-year retrofitting program, and there are a number of soft story apartment buildings in this town that are in the same boat essentially, and something for community development to follow on. Also, Dr. Lanny Ebenstein commented that the city might get on board with Peabody Stadium. There's rumors flying around. Okay, the Peabody Stadium, the natural turf was watered by city reclaimed water. There has been talk that it's too costly and they're going to go to plastic grass, i.e. artificial turf. And now people have to be aware of the controversy about cancer clusters, lymphoma, and the crumb rubber recycled tire material that's used as the backing in the artificial turf. So thank you.
Fred Sweeney will be followed by Scott Wentz.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, Council. City Clerk's Office advised me because of my schedule that I needed to come in and request in front of you consideration for my reappointment to the Single Family Design Review Board. So I'm making such request, and I'm here to respond to any questions that you may have.
Why don't you just use your minute 30 seconds to talk about as if you were here on an interview?
Well, one of the things that's pretty challenging about being on the Single Family Design Board is that I think you're all aware now that this board is sometimes akin to an elementary school board, which I worked with many of those boards for several years. And it's one of those boards where everybody has an opinion and they really have a hands-on thing. And so we have that because everybody lives in a neighborhood. They all live next door to someone that wants to do something. And so sometimes we are adjudicating neighborhood spats that have nothing to do with the architecture. So, but I think the response to that is being able to conduct our meetings a little bit more like you conduct your meetings rather than the way we used to, which was pretty laissez-faire. So I think that's the one thing in the last 4 years that I've observed as we've gone through this process. But short of that, I'm sure there may be some members of the community that would not like me to be back on the board. But I think overall, my contribution has been positive and hopefully will continue to be. So,
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss has a question.
Will you continue as chair, do you know?
I think that's up to my colleagues on the board and how we do that.
Your term is up when as chairman?
I think it will be up at the end of this calendar year.
I see. Okay.
But
Thank you.
I'm not sure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, and thank you for your service.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Scott Wentz will be followed by David Hopkins.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, Scott Wentz representing Cars Are Basic. I get off the air television. I was watching San Diego PBS, and I saw an interview of the mayor of the city of Santa Barbara talking about the desal plant. And the host asked her, well, how she makes decisions. She said, I make decisions on the best possible available information. That's a pretty close quote. In 2012, on September 14th, I believe it was, we made a request to the City of Santa Barbara to provide any and all information it had proving that bulb outs make pedestrians safer. At the end of September, this Public Works Director, Christine Anderson, had to admit that, in fact, there were no such studies, and they had no such studies, and the city statistics did not prove that bulb outs make pedestrians safer, which means that George Girth, Rob Dayton, Drusilla Van Hingel, Browning Allen, and other members of the staff had lied when they said, we have facts proving that bulb outs make pedestrians safer. Approximately 3 weeks ago, you had an accident at Santa Barbara Street and Ortega, where a mother and daughter were hit. The young child was hit very badly. That was at a location and the type of accident that the bulb outs were designed not to have occur. So you have no justification for spending the multi-millions of dollars you're spending up on Calle Paula, Colorado. And I fought that, and you ignored me. And I asked specifically what statistics you have proving that the bulb outs will make pedestrians safer, and how many of the accidents that were pedestrian accidents were due to the drunks hanging out in McKenzie Park. The city has, again, refused to answer. You're spending money irrationally, and you're wasting it. It's time to stop this and stop causing congestion.
Dave Hopkins will be followed by Bob Stout.
Hi, Madam Mayor, and congratulations, Mr. Rouse and Kathy. Congratulations. I'm up here because of a decision that's already been made, and it's with the police department and rearranging and allocating 740 hours and taking Officer Hove out of the position that he's in and working with the homeless. And I do outreach almost, for the last couple of years every day out there. And I just want to let you know, it's like, I'll use a scenario of you get a flat tire and you put on that little donut. So, and then you ride around on that donut and it's not the same, and you're taking something away from the police department and trying to fill it with a little donut. It's not going to work. And the trust issues that Officer Hove has built in the last 8 years with the public out there has been phenomenal. And for him to be going back out there and writing tickets again, it just, it takes the mistrust of the people out there to the whole city. It's not just going to be Officer Hove, it's against everyone. And to replace him is going to be almost impossible. He does the transporting to different places in Los Angeles or up north or whatever, and that's not going to happen. And Officer Burley's going to be a one-man team when originally it was supposed to be a three-man team, and now he's going to be solo. And he also is dealing with the veteran court, and the idea is to get all the veterans off the streets by the end of the year. And, I really wish Hove wasn't going because it's going to be detrimental to the city. So thank you.
Bob Stout will be followed by Richard Robinson.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, Council. I'm going to piggyback a little on what Mr. Hopkins just spoke about. I'm representing downtown Santa Barbara. I'm the chair of the Safety Committee. Excuse me. And we were informed, I think late Friday or today, at our board meeting, we heard about the the cuts that are happening with the police department. We all know the police department's challenged, and we understand the intricacies of that. But I also would like to urge that the police department council consider who is cut. I know you can't tell the police department how to deploy, but we made our voices heard clearly. That in particular, I've worked with the State Street Outreach Program the last 6 months, and currently I think we identified 8 kind of frequent flyers, and 4 of those folks are housed presently. So we've made it's been a lot of work, and these folks have done a lot of the work. You sit at a table and you hear all the resources, all the people trying to help these folks. So that's important, and I hate to see the momentum stop on that because it's really we've gotten somewhere. Just yesterday, I was out with Zara Nair Moore, and we were doing an outreach, and we saw a pretty violent thing happen right on the corner, Coda and State. We tracked the person down, called the police officers, and eventually the person was at least spoken to or apprehended. I'm not sure which. So the point being that there's a lot going on, and I hate to see officers Casey Corbett, Keld Hove, and several others be taken off tactical patrol and reassigned in cars. I know there's people out in neighborhoods that want to see officers. I get that. I live in a neighborhood and occasionally need the officers out there. Final thing that I learned after the meeting was I also own the Wildcat Lounge, and about 10 years ago, whatever it was, we were the clubs really supported the police having a nightlife enforcement team. At the time, that was 3 officers that were specifically assigned to the nighttime activity, a lot of the folks out partying at night. And that was really helpful. That crew, that team was reduced to 2 and then reduced to 1, and that was Officer Mark Corbett. And I just found out that he's been taken off that. So that means we'll have nobody on the nightlife enforcement team. And I don't have time, and you don't have time to hear why that's important, but it really is. So I just urge council to stay on top of this.
Thank you. Richard Robinson.
Honorable Mayor and members, homelessness is not a sin. The problem is not homeless people. The problem is homelessness. Ma'am, because Proposition 30 is of such value, it should be extended. Your support vis-a-vis Proposition 30's extension shed lights on the need for its money in order to give hope to the homeless. You're the boss. You speak for us. I've been a homeless advocate for 44 years. Last month's pouring rain highlights the continuing trauma of the suffering many will experience as winter brings many into an already overburdened social services system. We will not have to worry in the spring because the swallows returning to Capistrano is going to bring a certain amount of money. That's obvious. However, the trauma cannot be overestimated. I've been there for 44 years. I'm not bragging, but when I left the University of Michigan, ma'am, in 1971, I didn't know that I'd be here. But I see, because of a certain fluidity my family has, that money is the solution. Some people say you can't throw money at a problem. And so I say that's the problem solution. But when I was a child, there was no welfare. We took care of each other. Proposition 30 should be extended. Like 13 was such a disaster. Thank you.
Stephen Groover, and the final speaker will be Sharon Byrne.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Groover. I know many of you personally, but I work with Common Ground Santa Barbara County, and specifically I'm the Downtown Homeless Outreach team leader, and I work alongside with the Milpas Homeless Outreach. I come here today because, like many others, it's been brought to my attention last week that Keld Hove will be reassigned to another position. And I just wanted the council members to know what a crucial role he has in the efforts that we have going on. Many of you guys know our projects and the success that we've had. That has been in large part because of Keld Hove's contribution as well as the restorative court. Burley is an amazing advocate, amazing man, and has really contributed a lot to our efforts. But this isn't a one-man job, as many people have said, and it's really difficult. And I think personally it's a step back for us on the efforts that we have in this community, especially with such a difficult issues that we deal with. So my request today is that the council would review and to be able to see what a crucial role Hove has. We often reach out to Hove and Burley for reunification. That's one of the strategies that we embrace as Common Ground, as well as C3H. And this is connecting people with family or environments that they might have elsewhere in the country and making sure that's a safe place. And so Hove is a crucial role by every time that we reach out to him. Sometimes he offers rides. Sometimes he knows of many other resources that we don't know, even as caseworkers, because they have an opportunity to connect with programs all over the country and specifically in LA and for us, that's a huge benefit because we don't have necessarily the time or the resources to be able to do that.
Thank you.
And yeah,
Thank you very much. Sharon Byrne?
I'm just going to pick up right where Stephen left off and say that not only does Hove do the transport and the reunification part, but removing him off restorative police and onto patrol halves the city's capacity for the restorative policing program. I mean, that's half the team, and actually that is the strongest anchor on the team. And I know you've made a consistent commitment to restorative policing, and I'm pretty sure you still have that commitment. So for us, this is a pretty serious shift in priorities that you might not have known about. The other thing that may not be known to you is that Hove also is the anchor on restorative court, which is a huge part of how we get individuals interested in making a change in their life and going in a different direction. Without him there serving in a large role in that court, no one there is certain of the future of that process. So we just want to bring it to your attention that this has happened, that obviously there's a fallout that's associated with that and a cost that's associated with that, and to please reestablish restorative policing as a city priority so that we can continue to have that resource. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's all the public comment speakers. Just to Mr. Casey, perhaps we could get an update about what's going on. It's the first, I think, at least I've heard about it, probably the rest of us, but in particular, the how it coordinates with restorative court, because there's a lot of moving parts there, and that's some of that's out of our control, some of it's in, so that would be helpful to get that info. Thank you. Moving on to consent calendar, we have some items to read.
Item number 3, reclassification of maintenance worker positions in the Facilities Management Division of the Public Works Department, recommending that council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending resolution number 15-056, the position and salary control resolution for fiscal year 2016, affecting the Public Works Department, effective November 14th, 2015. Item number 4, a resolution denying the appeal of the Montecito Association and upholding the decision of the Parks and Recreation Commission regarding tree removal at 1187 Coast Village Road, recommending that council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara denying the appeal of the Montecito Association and upholding the decision of the Parks and Recreation Commission to approve the removal of 2 Canary Island pine trees located in the front setback at 1187 Coast Village Road, pursuant to council's direction of October 2015. Item number 5, adoption of ordinance to grant easements to the County Flood Control District, recommending that council adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara approving the granting of easements on city-owned airport properties to the County of Santa Barbara Flood Control and Water Conservation District for flood control and all related purposes, and authorizing the city administrator to execute as necessary grant deeds in the form approved by the city attorney. Item number 15, Police Officer and Public Safety Dispatcher Recruitment Initiative Program, recommending that council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara establishing a police officer recruitment incentive program, providing referral incentives for city employees and hiring incentives for new police officers, and adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara establishing a public safety dispatcher recruitment initiative program, providing referral initiatives for city employees and hiring incentives for new public safety dispatchers. Item number 16, TEFRA, Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act hearing for 510 North Soprates debt issuance, recommending that council hold a public hearing and adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the City of Santa Barbara approving the issuance of revenue bonds by the California Municipal Finance Authority, an aggregate principal amount not to exceed $15 million for the purpose of financing the acquisition, construction, improvement, and equipping of a 40-unit multifamily rental housing facility and certain other matters related thereto.
Thank you. Without further objection, we'll waive further reading. Mr. Hotchkiss, you wanted to pull item 4, which was
Please,
the
Madam Mayor.
resolution on the appeal. And do you want to state
Yes, I wasn't here for either the site visit or the vote, so I should abstain.
Okay. So if we can have a motion for item 4.
So moved.
Moved by Hart, second by White. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? 0 opposed and 1 abstention. So 601. Okay. And then, Mr. Hart, you wanted item 10 and item 15?
Yes.
Let's do item 10 first. This is the, can you read item 10, actually? That would be great.
Aircraft noise monitoring and flight tracking services, license and maintenance, technical support agreement.
Mr. Hart?
Yeah, I just was curious, in light of the airport's ongoing fiscal concerns, just wanted to make sure this is absolutely necessary. I understand how important having the noise tracking system is overall for the airport, but just wanted to make sure, is this something that's required for that system to be operational on an annual basis, or is this an upgrade? Just exactly how would you characterize this contract?
This is required to have the system operational. Without this, we don't have a means of getting the data necessary to respond to the complaints.
So could you tell me a little bit more how the system works? This, I think, the first time I've actually seen this service highlighted through a contract. I think your microphone went off there.
Okay, thank you. The service provides us with flight tracking and noise monitoring capability, and by far the one used the most is the flight tracking. We're able to get specific location and altitude data for pretty much most any plane that comes in or out of the airport. People call in with a complaint, they'll leave the time and the location, and we're able to go in, look at flight tracks and determine which one it was. We're able to many times then listen to the conversations between tower and airplane so we can figure out why that was done, and then we're able to respond to those complaints that way. It also gives us great generalized flight tracks so we can see where the majority of planes are flying if they're adhering to our noise abatement request, and then it also allows us to store noise data for future environmental work.
Okay, thank you very much.
You need to vote on that separately? No? Okay, and then item 15, and then Mr. White had an item as well. Item 15 is the Police Officer Public Safety Dispatcher Recruitment Incentive Program, which you already read into the record. So, Mr. Hart?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate this extra effort. This is a great, I think, additional tool to use in the recruitment process. As I think you probably heard from public comment, we're getting concerns from the particular constituencies that have officers that have a great reputation and longstanding service in particular subspecialties. And I know you're doing your best to cover all these spots, but you don't have the ability to do that given the number of officers that are available for service. So having this recruitment tool is really critically important, and I appreciate that, and I think this is a great step in the right direction. But I wanted to add that I think it's appropriate at this time, given how I think this comment we had today from public comment about the loss of Officer Hove in the downtown core is sort of the beginning of something we're going to hear a lot more of, because I think that you're by necessity going to have to move people around. So it just underscores the urgency of this job to upgrade the recruitment retention efforts. This is helpful, but I'd really like to see a comprehensive look at the effort. And this may just be one piece of it, but I think it's really important to have a fresh eyes look at the whole effort and to say, and to benchmark it to other organizations and to the best practices that are available around the country. This is an opportunity, I think, with the chief's retirement to have just fresh eyes, independent look at things, and just to be able to have the information available to the next chief for them to have data about where we are in this system. I think it would be a great legacy to have this transition occur this way, and if it takes additional resources from the council to pay for something like that, I'd like to see that come back, have us talk about that, because there's really some very important policy questions involved in this effort. And I know the Chief, you've spoken very eloquently in the past to the criticalness of us not lowering our standards in recruitment. But I have to think that that may have evolved over time to where we don't have to be lower in our standards, but we might have to have different standards at this point in time. So, and I was struck, I saw in the paper yesterday that there were 20 sheriff's officers that had gone through the academy process. And I didn't read the details of that specifically. I don't know if it's an apples and oranges comparison, but other agencies are doing different things and getting different results. So I'd just like to know very precisely what it is that we're doing, that is resulting in folks not making it through the system in comparison to other agencies that may or may not be having that experience, and what is the difference, and have all that information in a very neutral way available for future decision making.
One of the things, I'll start before Captain Torres says anything, but tomorrow we're actually having a meeting with Mr. Casey and Pam and HR and Christy and my staff. We've hit the ground running since we had the discussion at the last department update. We've been on it every day. I think this is, I agree, a great start. Tomorrow we're looking at everything that we do. We're looking at all our forms, the way we do things, how other departments do things, and that meeting is tomorrow.
Good.
And to really sort of strategize from not just a police standpoint, but a city hall standpoint and your priorities as to what to do next. And that meeting is tomorrow. So we're continuing to move. This is just one small piece, a beginning piece of what you asked me for about a month ago.
Well, perfect. I just want to say thank you again for taking the initiative on that. And again, if there are any resources that are needed, just from one council member's perspective, I would be prepared to spend significant money to help resource that effort. It's that important.
Madam Mayor, council members, I'll just speak briefly to the resource issue. I agree. One of the side effects of having so many vacancies is that the police department has quite a bit of salary savings. Before we go real aggressive on the use of those salary savings, I wanted to be briefed on what the whole plan is.
Good.
But this is one example where this costs some money, but we got it in salary savings.
Well worth it.
Let's get the bodies filled. Yep.
Thank you.
I'll let Captain Torres go ahead and add some comments, please.
Councilman Hart, council members, I agree with the things that we're working on with the rest of the staff. I'm here with my assistant, Lieutenant Stoney. We're aggressively looking at a three-pronged approach. We're looking at not only entry officers, but the lateral. We're taking a really aggressive stance on lateral officers. Other agencies throughout the state, that gives you an immediate impact as far as having people on the street in the shortest amount of time, because academies take 6 months to go through academy. A lateral, it's much shorter training period, and we get the people out real fast. That's why this incentive, it's kind of the norm that a lot of agencies are going that way now because it's so competitive. If you look, there's a statewide magazine that all members of law enforcement get, and we're going to advertise monthly on this with, for other agencies. We might have somebody from Santa Barbara working someplace else, and they see this. Now we're hiring laterals, come to Santa Barbara. We're using all resources to get people over. And I might add, what compounds the problem is we have 18 injury, IOD, or others. That makes it twice as difficult because not only we currently have 9 openings, anticipating further down the line, but what compounds it is having the 18 injured or out for extended leave, which makes it difficult.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to maybe make a clarification, maybe give Chief an opportunity. One of the previous speakers mentioned cuts. And I know from the council standpoint, there's been no cuts whatsoever. And I wanted to maybe allow you a chance to clarify that or to state why we're having the situation that was brought up earlier.
Thank you. There are absolutely no cuts in the police department in any position, sworn or non-sworn. What has occurred, and Captain Torres mentioned it briefly, we have currently 18 injuries or others who are not at work, sworn. That's a lot. We haven't had that number of injuries and others for quite a few years. Patrol is our number one job, responding to 911 calls and other calls for service. Currently, in the last couple of months, if we look at our CompStat statistics, our call for service response times are going up, and it's because we need more people in patrol, quite simply. It's also an officer safety issue. We want to have enough people out there to help each other out and back each other up. It's not an easy job, and sometimes it is dangerous. I felt that we needed to make some changes, so we reassigned individuals who were going to leave that assignment this January anyway. They were due out. Officer Hove has been extended 2 years already, but he was due out this January. We were going to replace him, but until we get more people back healthy, we won't be able to replace him. What has been cut, if you will, if you want to put that word to it, is a couple of programs that Craig Burley will have. He's going to cut back on, but it has nothing to do with the attention given to State Street and the clients in the parks and State Street. It's some administrative things that he no longer is going to do that we're going to have other people do. So things are basically going to remain the same. Officer Hope has done a fabulous job. He's an all-star, no doubt. Officer Corbett is going back to patrol. She was due out in January. And certainly we wish we could replace them with other people, but that would mean taking from patrol, and that's where we have the least amount of people in terms of the services we provide. At the end of the day, everything's important and everything's a priority, and these competing priorities really forced me, if you will, to step up how many people we have in patrol for officer safety and for response times to emergencies as our number one priority. In the interim, we've graduated a few that are now in training. In a few weeks, they will be out on their own. That'll help. We have 5 in the academy now. They do not get out until April, so it takes a while. I think the issue that Captain Torres brought up in terms of laterals is wide open, and I think that might be very successful. I think we're on the right path, but we absolutely, Councilman Rouse, we've made no cuts. We've made some reassignments, including a detective to leave the detective working cases to go back to patrol. And she's fabulous, but we need her in patrol. Again, that's our number one job. Our number one priority is to make sure that when people call dispatch that they have a blue suit standing at their door ASAP, 6 minutes or less. It's clearly more than that right now because of the number of people that we have out. It's pretty unprecedented, but when you have 18 sworn people out, injured and other, it takes a toll. Not just on the number piece, but on those that are working and how hard and how much more is placed on them because 18 people are not working. So this was not an easy decision, but it was a decision that I felt I needed to make in order to lift the numbers on our patrol staff level. And we're going to go and continue to work hard, but that was a necessity. But the answer at the end of the day is no, we made no cuts to the police department.
And by other, you mean leave of absence or?
Yes, could be medical issues or other issues that they're out. But 18 sworn is a lot, and that hurts patrol more than anyone else, and we need to keep that up for the reasons I mentioned.
Mr. Hart?
Yeah, that reminds me that that's probably something also to look really deeply at, too, to see if there is anything that we can do that other agencies are doing, in terms of preventive efforts to reduce the number of injuries. I don't know what these are. I don't have any idea what it's about. I don't know if they're preventable. I'm sure 99% of them are accidents that are just bad luck. But it is true that over the last couple of years, we have had an extraordinary number of people that have been out for one reason or another. And at some point, it isn't extraordinary anymore. It becomes kind of the standard operating procedure. And that's something I think we need to have a really deep look at to see whether or not we need to overhire in order to maintain a certain level of availability of officers. And so these things are connected. And I just think that this is the opportunity to really take a very deep look at both of these issues and have some information available so that we can benchmark these things.
For quite a few years now, under the direction of the mayor, we have been overhiring for quite a few years now. And, we're chasing our tail and, in many ways, and we lose some to other departments as other departments do. And the injuries are the worst. And when we're talking about of the 18, many of them are injuries that are pretty serious injuries, and hopefully they'll come back to work. And they are injuries that occurred on duty, doing their job, protecting the city, and in some cases, pretty heavy injuries that the officers want to be back, but they can't, and they understand that. And I think we're going to continue to work hard and try to catch up somehow. But in terms of preventative, I think risk management does a great job of assisting us with things in terms of injuries and preventative seminars. We do plenty of training on injuries and preventative injuries. But in this business, unfortunately, it's going to happen. I don't have any malingerers over there saying they're hurt when they're not hurt. These folks are seriously hurt in many cases and may not come back. So the challenge is huge, and we're going to give it our best.
I'd like to add one other thing, too. Another thing we really need to take a serious look at is our retention issue. I give an example is a few years ago I hired 9 at one time, and to this date, there's only 4 that remain out of that 9. A lot of them have gone back to areas that they're from. So that's where this hiring bonus, it's built in as a retention issue as far as they don't get the third payment until they've been here 3 years. So we're not losing them at 2 years. So it's an incentive to stay a little longer because once they're here the 3 years, we have a better luck of keeping them staying in Santa Barbara than going back to where they're at. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm
Welcome.
assuming you don't need to vote on this separately. And then, Mr. White, you wanted to have a question on item 13. If you could read item 13. Thank you very much.
Appropriation of Human Services grant funds for Youth Apprentice and Santa Barbara Arts Alliance programs.
Thank you, Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I didn't understand how this is pulled out from the other human service grants, and I didn't know whether there was a source that was different or whether this was part of the whole package that customarily is funded. So I just want to get a little more information on the source of funds or the process here.
Madam Mayor, council members, you approved these grants as part of your combined grant process. The fact that it's city programs, there's just an accounting procedure that we need to technically receive the money and appropriate the money. And so because these are 2 city functions, that's why you're seeing this on the consent calendar. But it was already approved by the committee and approved by you as council. This is just an accounting issue at this point.
We approved the outflow, and this is approving the inflow.
Correct.
Okay. From one department to another. Okay, I need a motion for the balance of the consent calendar.
You have it, Madam Mayor.
There we go. Let's see. Moved by Murillo, second by Hotchkiss. All in favor?
Aye.
Great. All right, thank you. And we move on to item number 19.
Updated City Council Rules of Procedure, recommending that Council introduce and subsequently adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending Chapter 2.04 of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code pertaining to council meetings, and adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara adopting rules of procedure governing the conduct of the City Council meetings and rescinding Resolution Number 09-097.
Thank you, Mr. Kalan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. This is a very important subject that could use a glamorous name, and it doesn't have that with council rules of procedure. So I'm going to try and illustrate why these rules are important in terms of establishing your compact, your promises, your bond with the voters and residents of Santa Barbara. Let's start with the process. It's been about 7 years since the last time council took a look at these rules, and a lot has changed both on the legal front and in terms of how you're actually running your meetings. You formed an ad hoc committee back in May, and council members Hotchkiss, White, and Murillo worked hard over the summer to give direction to your staff. City Administrator Casey, myself, and City Clerk Services Manager Pierce worked with that committee to come up with the proposal in front of you. As we worked through the issues, 4 emerging themes came out. And I think this is where there may be a little bit more to it than just rules. First, improving public participation became a driving theme in several areas in the rules. Sunshine and transparency, and by that I mean sunshine in government, open government, transparent government that is visible to its residents and to voters so that people know what's going on. There are some streamlining measures that are meant to make the meetings work a little bit better, council meetings. And finally, the committee identified at my recommendation some areas where fair hearing rules should be updated to meet modern legal standards. Let's talk about public participation. The existing council rules allow only 1 minute for public participation. Now, the mayor has, of course, consistently given people 2 minutes, but that's never been in your rules. So the first proposal is to double the time for public comment from 1 minute to 2 minutes. And it sounds like a small thing, but it's an important statement to make. It does conform to your existing practice, and we still retain the 30-minute limit.
The important change is that the committee's recommending adding a second public comment period at the end of the meeting if you have more than 15 speakers, so that the 30-minute time limit is reached at the beginning of the meeting. That's a way of assuring that everyone who shows up will have an opportunity to address the council. Now, I recognize that that could make for some long afternoons when controversial subjects come up, but I think that goes with the turf for all of us. The mayor has been authorizing speakers to pool time by taking the time from members of the public who are here in the audience but who wish not to speak. And the practice has been to add up those 2 minutes to as many as 20 minutes at a time. These rules propose to continue to allow pooling of time, but to cap it at 10 minutes. So whether there are 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 speakers pooling their time, the maximum limit would be 10 minutes. Let's talk about sunshine and transparency.
Excuse me just a sec, but somebody could double up and have 10 and 10, correct?
2 people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
The rules propose a fairly dramatic change in requiring council members to use their best efforts to share emails that are sent to a majority of the council. This is a Brown Act and Public Records requirement. The law currently says that writings that go to a majority of the council need to be provided to the city clerk and made available to the public. I'm going to speak very bluntly and plainly about this situation. It typically occurs in connection with land use hearings, and an applicant or an applicant's attorney will attempt to lobby the city council over a weekend before a meeting, and no one knows that that happens. It's completely invisible to the public. The law wants that to be a public activity. So when your emails show CCs to a majority of the council, or you have a reason to believe that an email or letter, for that matter, has been given to a majority of the council, you've got an obligation to provide a copy to the City Clerk Services Manager.
Mr. Cullen, in addition to the circumstances you're describing, we frequently get emails addressed to everybody on council about homelessness, a water main broke, you name it. That happens many, many times a week in a typical week. Is there some way that we could automate this process? I mean, I don't have any problem, obviously, with forwarding an email like that, but it's kind of crazy to have all 7 of us responsible for forwarding those emails.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, the city has tried to do that by publicizing the email address council@santabarbaraca.gov, and with any luck, people will use that. If they don't, you're only obligated to forward matters that relate to an agenda item. So this doesn't interfere with someone's ability to lobby you privately about, pick a subject, enacting a new law. It only applies to agenda items.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So just to clarify the type of examples Mr. Francisco said about something happened yesterday on State Street and you all need to know about it, that's not an agenda item, that's information, but if it's related to restorative policing budget and you're talking about just because that came up today, that might be then related to an agenda item that should be forwarded.
That's correct.
Okay, and when you said the promoting the mayor and council email address, does that include the clerk automatically so that the clerk gets it? Is that what you meant by?
I believe that the
We'll check on that, I guess, right?
we'll need to add the clerk if they are
Right.
not on
Okay,
that.
so if someone clicks on the group email list, it would include all 7 of us plus whomever else the clerk, I guess, who can decide how to disseminate it. Okay. Thank you.
Madam Mayor?
Yes, Ms. Moran.
May I add something, Mr. Kalan, that we had in our committee discussion? We were concerned that the city clerk would be inundated with a bunch of emails if all 7 of us said, we better forward this to Ms. Pierce. And Ms. Pierce said, bring it on, that she can handle. It's better to have her receive the information than for us to hold it back. So thanks.
The next new rule is intended to discourage people dumping a pile of paper on you the day of a public hearing. It is virtually impossible for you to digest complex, usually legal arguments when they're given to you at the last second. So the proposed rules encourage applicants or appellants or members of the public to submit their materials in time for them to be included with the packet, so that you can have that Thursday through Tuesday period to review the materials, and so that other members of the public can have an opportunity to review that as well. Now, it doesn't forbid the council from taking into account late submitted materials, but it does say that you don't have a duty to do so. And there is case law that appears, in my opinion, to support a city council not taking into account last-minute data dumps.
Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And Mr. Clun, I certainly agree with that, and I've told people many times that, you know, a file this thick submitted to City Council an hour before the council meeting is not likely to have an effect. So I understand the intention here, but I had a question from a constituent that made a lot of sense to me. She read this and she said, now wait a minute, if I have to submit it on the Tuesday before the Tuesday council meeting and the agenda hasn't even been published, how will I know if there's an item on there that I would want to comment on and now I can't? So there's the perception there, at least, that it has to be there by the Tuesday before in order to be considered at all, and I don't think that was your intention.
No, Councilmember Francisco, it does say that they're encouraged to do that, so that a two-page letter submitted on Tuesday is one thing. 500 pages of substantive material that is meant to exhaust administrative remedies for a lawsuit against the city is something else.
Right. And I just think maybe we could clarify the language a little bit here so that people realize, of course, they can still turn in something on Friday, you know, if it's a one-page memo or something. Yeah.
The next sunshine measure is to modify agendas so that people are clear when you have a quasi-judicial hearing in front of you. Right now, the council and the public have no way of knowing, unless they have legal advice, whether the special fair hearing rules apply to a given agenda item, so that they are not encouraged to contact you and lobby you ahead of a council meeting. What we're going to do is include a bold-faced heading that indicates the council's fair hearing rules, quasi-judicial hearing rules apply to given agenda items. Typically, that's appeals with the city council, but there are some instances where it might involve revocation proceedings on tow permits or something like that. So the idea here is to modify the agenda slightly so that both you and your constituents can see quickly which rules apply to the agenda item. That, I hope, will minimize the uncomfortable conversation at Trader Joe's when a constituent approaches you in the line and says, I really would like you to save those trees or cut those trees down, either way. And we know from advice I've given earlier that those kinds of discussions need to be avoided when we're dealing with a quasi-judicial matter. But we'll get into that in a second.
Mr. Hart?
So just so I really understand this, you know, the front page of our agenda has a lot of paragraphs that kind of describe what the council meeting, how it operates. Would you propose that this is going to be just another paragraph as part of that, and then the actual item is going to have some sort of bold-faced asterisk that refers to that, or?
Councilmember Hart, the latter. Each relevant agenda item will have a bold-face heading that says quasi-judicial hearing rules apply.
And then the definition of what those rules are will also be on this agenda, or
no? But there'll be a reference to a website on the agenda where people can review the rules.
Okay.
Let's talk about streamlining your meetings. The big one is to replace Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order are designed for large legislative bodies that meet over many, many days. So imagine a elected legislative an elected body's legislative session that lasts the entire summer. They're 700 pages long. Enforcing them doesn't happen. You don't follow them. And it's time to move on. A judge in Northern California, Judge Rosenberg, drafted a modern set of rules of order that are specifically designed for city councils and boards of directors of local public agencies. We're recommending that the council move to using Rosenberg's rules of order rather than Robert's rules. Okay, this is a big change. Right now, at times during hearings, the City Council has cards coming up for speakers throughout the hearing. And in some instances, people jockey to be the last speaker or to be towards the end or to be in a particular position. That makes it difficult to manage the meeting. What the committee's proposing, and I recommended, is that the City Council not accept speaker cards after the item is called, so that people can't attempt to game the system, and so that the mayor can allocate time fairly by knowing that there's a fixed number of cards in front of her. So let's say there are 20 speakers, the mayor might allocate people 3 minutes apiece, because we've got an hour to spend on it. If 20 more cards come in during the hearing, the meeting is just mushroomed from an hour to 2 hours. So this is a significant change. I'm recommending it, but it is a policy matter for you to grapple with.
Mr. Rouse?
Mr. Colon, was that, so if you look back on one of the third or fourth slide, then we talk about adding a second public comment period at the end of the meeting. Would that pertain to that then? Would those? Or would
No,
this be
we're
a totally
talking
different
about during.
Okay, just during a specific.
During
agenda
agenda
item. Okay.
items. Right.
And just maybe to also ask the committee, the rationale of the timing after the items announced versus after the staff report is completed or something like that. Because I can imagine a situation where you're in the room and maybe you're speaking or maybe you're not, but something was said during the staff report that might then say, now I really do want to speak on this. So I just, from the committee, if there was discussion on that.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I don't support this one at all. And I'm sorry, I'm not remembering making such an objection in the committee meetings. I think people should be able to stand up and speak when they want to. And in fact, I like it when someone hasn't even filled out a slip and they say, hey, I'm going to go up there, and then they fill out their slip. That I would lean towards leniency, please.
All right, well, we can go ahead, Mr. White.
Madam Mayor, I think that's a good point to be that you make, or a good question you ask about the progress of an item and how it evolves as we're in hearing. Just as we ourselves press the button, sometimes just asking questions. Certainly, the notion of the item being announced, that would be, I could see people going forward with saying, okay, well, this is the item I would want to put in a slip to speak at the announcement. Is there a cutoff point? I've seen it certainly regularly where, okay, there is a point where you stop taking in slips and things drag on. And I think that's worth us having a discussion about, because it can go on. And I hadn't actually considered the notion of engineering a spot to speak last. Usually people are trying to speak first rather than speak last so they can get out. But I can appreciate that that could be an item of concern. But I think perhaps some more discussion is in order for that.
Mr. Hart?
Should we have this discussion now, or should we let Mr.
Why
Kalan
don't
go through the
Mr.
presentation?
Kalan finish his presentation, then we can figure out if we want to make any amendments to anything. Go ahead.
From time to time, enthusiastic members of the public bring in signs. And the City Council chambers is what we would call a limited public forum. That means that it's not like a park or a sidewalk where any First Amendment activity can happen. For example, there's no constitutional right to panhandle in the City Council chambers. What you've done is open this room for certain kinds of activities. And so you have the authority to limit First Amendment expression in reasonable ways. One of the concerns that I noticed looking at other cities' rules of procedure had to do with pole signs and the obvious danger of someone getting whacked by a pole sign. So the proposal would be to forbid pole signs. The other concern are very large signs, and from time to time we'll have two people bringing in a 3-foot by 5-foot poster board, trying to tack it up on the wall or put it in the back of the room or put it on chairs. So the rule tries to very simply say that you can bring in any sign so long as it doesn't obstruct the view of anyone else. And that explains the reason for the rule as well.
I'm sorry on this one, and I forget, I don't think it's in here, but I'll bring up a situation that's come up a couple of times where someone wanted to speak and deliberately put a mask on so we didn't know who they were and wouldn't give their name. And it had a safety element for me personally. So I asked that person either to take off the mask or sit back down. And I just did that because I felt that was appropriate, but I don't know if there's any kind of First Amendment regulation or some kind of procedure or something that we could point to in that situation as well. It was more of a safety issue than anything else.
I think that it's certainly a perceived safety issue, but the courts have been pretty clear that the kinds of behavior you can regulate in the council chambers are only those kinds of behavior that actually disrupt the meeting.
Okay.
So refusing to give your name, for example, or wearing a mask, or in the most extreme example, out of Santa Cruz, giving a Nazi salute to the city council, have been deemed behaviors that don't actually disrupt a meeting. So there's a fairly wide swath that the courts have cut through your power to regulate meeting behavior. This is a matter of courtesy. People forget to silence their phones. I think it's simple and common now to ask people to silence their phones before they come into the meeting. The council currently gives appellants and applicants 30 minutes during your quasi-judicial public hearings. In my experience, that's a tremendous amount of time. Typically, you'll see 10 to 15 minutes allowed, with authority for the mayor to grant more time if it's necessary. So recognizing that I might be treading on tradition in Santa Barbara, I recommended to the committee that the time limits be considered for reduction. The committee's proposal was to go from 30 minutes to 20 minutes. It's a modest change. The mayor still retains the authority to give more time if it's deemed necessary to give a full presentation. The rules also have a 30-minute limit on council deliberations that's completely unenforced and unenforceable, in my opinion, so we're recommending taking that out. And finally, the 2.5-hour time limit for appeals is grossly excessive most of the time and unenforceable as well, so we're recommending taking that out. The proposal modernizes what are fairly archaic decorum rules. Again, as I mentioned, actual disruption of the meeting is required. For example, the current rules forbid impertinent comments. I think I've heard staff make impertinent comments before, so we clearly are not enforcing that and probably couldn't. This meets new case law standards. Let's jump to fair hearing requirements. And I'm hesitant to say there are constitutional rights here. There are statutory interests in California under the Code of Civil Procedure that fair hearings be afforded, and there's certainly a constitutional interest in having a fair hearing, but the courts have not imposed the full range of court rules on a city council yet. So these rules attempt to draw a balance between what current standards appear to be, from what we know from court rulings, and the practical reality of running a city council meeting. What is a quasi-judicial hearing? Let's put some meat on that concept. It's typically, in our context, a hearing where there's a significant property interest at stake, whether it's my backyard or the property to be developed. Either owner, either resident has a significant property interest that's at stake, and the Constitution requires due process before the government significantly interferes with property. The key part of the rule is to discourage what are called ex parte contacts. As we know, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances is constitutional in origin. So the people have a right to talk to you. They have a right to meet with you. They have a right to lobby you to take positions on certain laws. And you have a right, as an elected official, when you're in the process of making law, to have strong biases and strong feelings and act on those biases and feelings. So if, for example, you're confronted with creating a new zoning ordinance, it's okay to feel like fish markets shouldn't be allowed in residential zones, as an example. Those biases, those feelings are appropriately expressed both publicly and privately for legislators. When you're acting and affecting property rights in a quasi-judicial context, you are much more constrained in the kinds of information you can listen to and the kinds of comments you can make, because the people in front of you are entitled to a fair hearing, and that means they're entitled to fair judges. Judges can't make their minds up before they've heard all the evidence, and they can't make their minds up based on evidence that comes to them outside the courtroom. So the rule against ex parte contacts is a long way of saying that you need to discourage people from lobbying you about quasi-judicial hearing matters outside of the earshot of the other party in the case. It's flat unfair for one side to get to the judge and persuade her without the other side knowing what the arguments are. So
is this an appropriate time to delve into that? Because I do have some questions about it. Typically, on an appeal, we may get multiple, or do get multiple emails from neighbors or whatever. How should we handle that? Should we just delete them, or?
No, those should be, Councilmember Hotchkiss, those emails, if they've gone to a majority of the council, would be forwarded to the city clerk.
Right.
And an enterprising applicant or appellant would know by virtue of these rules and their own thoroughness to contact the city clerk to find out what information's come in.
Okay, so basically we still are open to public comment at that point, but just to be sure that we give it to the city clerk so that can be made public to everybody.
Yes, and on occasion you'll get a piece of written material that is so persuasive to you that it affects your thinking on the matter. Then you have to disclose that contact. So the second part of this rule, first part is to avoid those contacts. The second part is if they do happen, and the courts recognize they might for you as local elected officials, you're not cloistered, you're not hiding behind a 10-foot high bench, and you're not wearing a robe. So people are going to be approaching you, and you're supposed to be accessible. If those contacts do occur, you disclose them at the start of the hearing. And the mayor's been very careful to call for disclosure of ex parte contacts over the last several years.
Mr. Hart?
So what does avoid and discourage mean? I mean, as a practical matter, what is it you're saying that we can and can't do?
You can't invite a community meeting in your living room from all the opponents of a development project that's on appeal to the city council. On the other hand, if a opponent of the project, again, gets you while you're in the checkout line at Trader Joe's, you should say it would be more appropriate for you to bring your comments to the city council on Tuesday so that all my colleagues can hear your arguments. I think they're good arguments. And discourage that kind of contact with that deflecting effort.
So we frequently, when upcoming appeal the applicant, the appellant, or an interested party will call the office and say, I'd like to meet with council members to present my case. And I know your recommendation has just been don't take the meeting.
That's
and
right.
so that is connected to what you're saying here as well. And I think the communication piece back to the community is where it's not like we're not listening. We just want to follow this quasi-judicial hearing process and had everything related to the appeal, for example, here in the council chambers as opposed to my office with only one side of the room present. Is that?
Madam Mayor, that's precisely the issue.
Okay. Mr. Hart, did you have something else?
Yeah, just to finish this up. So you have given this advice in the past about the better way to approach it. Each of us has sort of made our own judgment about our ability to balance that information input, and we have disclosed those ex parte communications before the hearings. So that would still be up to us to choose to do that or not, or are you saying that these new rules would really prohibit that and that we would not be able to do that?
The words are avoid and discourage, so it's not flatly prohibited. The rules need to recognize reality that someone may approach you, and before you can say don't, they do. But you would be required, if those comments influence your point of view, to disclose those comments before the hearing began. And again, the reason is so that the other side can know what's influencing you and can modify their presentation to persuade you otherwise.
So, but you're saying it's only if they persuade your point of view. So taking a meeting in your office prior to an appeal may or may not persuade your point of view, but you would want to disclose that or not disclose it?
I would discourage that. The rules discourage that kind of session. They're not meeting with you because they love you. They're meeting with you because they want you to vote a certain way. So that's exactly the kind of meeting that's to be avoided and discouraged. But
if it happens?
The disclosure rule is meant to allow incidental contacts to go without necessarily disclosing them. So, for example, 6 months prior to the appeal, you have a brief discussion while, let's say, there are story polls up on a site with one of the neighbors. You haven't thought about this case. It hasn't influenced you. You wouldn't be in violation of the rules if you forgot to disclose that. So the point of the limitation on disclosure to items that significantly influence your point of view is to recognize reality for a local elected official, that they're going to be contacted all the time, and you can't deflect that entirely.
And then just to follow up, the disclosure is not just of the content, but contact, but the content that persuaded you one way or another?
Absolutely.
So you want to say why you thought whatever was said was valid or not valid?
Right. Mr. Jones, the neighbor adjacent to this project, approached me and indicated that he'd invested $850,000 in a view deck and that this project would block his view.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
That's meaningful information that ought to be disclosed. Now, we've talked about avoid and discourage. There is one instance where the law is clear that you absolutely cannot have the ex parte contact, and that's between the time the hearing is closed and you haven't made up your mind. Why? The other side doesn't have a chance to unring the bell that you might hear in the checkout line at Trader Joe's. So in the instance of this tree appeal we just worked on over the last month and you approved today, these rules would have said you can't have contacts of any kind with either side after you've made your decision, but before it's final. The last one is a nod to technology, and it's also recognizing a small but growing trend among cities. We all have our things, our devices, and this council is particularly careful to devote its full attention to the speakers during public hearings. I do pay attention when I'm sitting there, and that's what I've observed. The public in many situations would be concerned that viewing phones or other electronic devices is a means of communicating off the record during the hearing. And in fact, a case pending in the California Supreme Court right now involving the city of San Jose grew up out of an allegation that text messages were exchanged between council members during a hearing, influencing the outcome of that decision. So what this rule does is very specific. It forbids the use of electronic devices for communication during public hearings that are required by law. It wouldn't forbid, for example, Councilmember Francisco from researching a subject on his computer or reviewing the agenda on his computer. But it does forbid communications, and not just communications about the subject matter, any communications. The last subject is a difficult one, and you might ask why I'm raising it. I'm raising it because it does come up from time to time, and your existing rules of procedure have some very funny language about what to do if closed session confidentiality is violated. The rule that's being proposed would allow the city council member to censure one of its members if they violate the rules of procedure. That's meant to give you some means of outing publicly the misbehavior of one of your colleagues if it's extreme. We haven't seen anything like this in Santa Barbara as far back as I can remember. There are other cities where, unfortunately, council members act up and act out during council meetings in a way that can be abusive of staff as well as the public, and sometimes the city council feels the need to act. So censure is, as I mentioned, essentially a public admonishment or the imposition of some restrictive rule to prevent that kind of behavior in the future. That's the last piece of this slideshow, and I'll sit down and turn it over to you for deliberation.
Thank you. And thank you to the committee. Do we have any public comment speaker slips on this item? Okay. So it's to the council. Ms. Murillo.
Thanks. I wanted to ask a question of Mr. Kalan. So what would be at the discretion of the mayor? For instance, if someone brought a sign in that was kind of okay but not disturbing anybody, for instance, or like when to cut off public comment in the beginning, vox populi. So say there were, like you're saying, 15 speakers. What if there was 16 or 17? And the mayor said, you know what, we're just going to stretch it a little bit. Would that be okay? Does the mayor have discretion in fine points like that?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, the mayor does have a lot of discretion to apply the rules and to modify the rules, subject to a majority of the council directing the mayor to do otherwise. So the power rests, like everything else you do, in the full council. The mayor is your instrument or representative in dealing with these issues. So if you object to an action the mayor's taking, let's say the mayor is one of these council members I mentioned that act up or act out in public, the majority of the council can control that behavior.
So someone would make a motion and say, you know what, we really need to cut this off, and make a motion. It's seconded, and then we vote on it.
That's correct.
It would be a point of order motion, I guess, right?
Okay. Okay.
So just to go back to the public comment piece, so we have a 30-minute, it's 15 speakers if they all take 2 minutes, but it's a 30-minute time period. If you have 20 speakers and they all fit within the 30 minutes, that's still within the guidelines. Is that what the suggestion is here, or we just stop it at 15?
I think that the mayor has to have some discretion.
Oh, okay.
If you can get it done, you can get it done.
And then the second I know you had some other things, but since you just brought up the topic, the second public comment time is not for someone who spoke the first time around to get a second bite at the apple, correct? So we would have to figure out, or the clerk would let us know if we don't remember that this person actually was here at the beginning of the meeting for public comment. It's not like they can come for a second time for public comment. It's just to continue if there was a long public comment list. Is that correct?
Madam Mayor, the way I imagined it working would be that you would have 20 cards submitted to you at the beginning of the meeting. You would take the first 15 and inform the other 5 that they would be heard at the end of the meeting.
Okay. Okay.
It wouldn't be an opportunity for people who hadn't submitted cards at the beginning to show up late to speak to you.
Got it. Got it. Ms. Mario, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just one last thing that was, well, actually two things. One, I think people are not going to understand. I think some people will come the day of with a letter, and so I know that's going to happen. And just some people don't understand this process, and so I would be, willing to read their letter the day of, and that's part of what we do sometimes. We're talking and listening, and we're reading a letter at the same time. It's kind of a cool skill. Second, just to go back to when the speaker cards are coming in, wow, I really want to object to that and say that I think that it really works well, the mayoral discretion, what I've seen you and others. So say the public comment thing is going on really long and you say, okay, 5 more minutes, and this, get them up now and then we're going to cut it off. I think that works really well. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Mr. Hart?
I think that this is a great effort. I think it's long overdue, and it's appropriate that we be fine-tuning these rules. But I do think that in the effort to look at all these issues and try and create a rule that applies, that there are going to be lots of instances that just don't practically fit into this. So I'm going to trust that even though we create these rules and have to have a box, that we're going to use this flexibility provision, and particularly in regards to public comment issues, because more public comment is better. And making it easier for the public to comment is better. If it causes a consequence to us in terms of the time of our meeting, that's not even an issue to me. So I understand where there's a circumstance where there's 100 speaker slips. I mean, I don't think this has ever occurred except maybe one time. The very first council meeting that I came back on, we had enormous public comment about the gang injunction, and it basically took up 2 hours, I think, before the meeting. That's the only time that's occurred. My recollection, including the previous term that I served, 2 terms I've served on. So it's a little bit of a solution in search of a problem, but I understand where you're going to look at all the rules. You have to say, well, how would we manage this and what would be a better solution? But I personally would always err to just continue public comment and just get it done. I don't want to get us into a new system where we start cutting people off after 15 speakers, because making those 5 people wait for an indeterminate length of time to the end of a council meeting is really an incredible burden. And I think it sends the message that we don't want to hear from people, that we're just going to tolerate a certain amount of time and then we're done. And similarly, cutting people's speaker slip submittal has that same feeling to me, because I don't think people come always organized about items in our agenda. Some people are even literally watching the proceedings at home, and they don't live that far away, and they can get down here in time and submit a speaker slip late. And again, I don't think it matters how long we take to do that. Similarly, submitting written material, I do think that's a great goal, but it isn't practical for people to know in advance of a council meeting, or even to know until they read the staff report what it is they want to talk about. So the best case scenario, I think, for somebody who's really organized is that they see our agenda and staff reports online and they want to comment, and that's already past the deadline that we're talking about. So I don't think that even makes sense to include in the rules. And then finally, as far as ex parte communication goes, I understand completely what you're saying about the fairness and giving everybody an opportunity to be heard in public. On the other hand, some of the issues that are before us are enormously complicated and very consequential and big things. And at the same time as we're saying we shouldn't be having any kind of communication with people ex parte, even though we might very well be meeting with both sets of people and spending a lot of time hearing their commentary, we're proposing to cut back the time that's available for them to talk to us in public to 20 minutes from 30 minutes. So I can definitely see a situation with a very complicated issue where 20 minutes isn't enough. And I think, from my experience doing this for a very, very long time, lots of hearings, lots of ex parte communications, being fair and explaining to the public what it is, who you've met with and when you've met with them and what they've said, I think protects the public interest in that regard, and it gives the flexibility to me as a decision maker to take more time for the issues that deserve that. So I would not support a rule that was hard and fast, and think that the safety valve of having disclosure of those ex parte communications meets the intent of what you're trying to do.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Hart, well, we already have a hard and fast rule, which is 30 minutes, so we're just suggesting we reduce that to 20. I don't know if that's too little or not, but regarding the same-day letter thing, I think Mr. Murillo is right. Generally, we will, of course, try to read whatever letter comes in at the last minute, but I think the point of this is to encourage people to submit it earlier so you have ample time to give it careful consideration. And up here, whizzing through while people are talking isn't fair to the person who's actually submitted the letter. So I would definitely encourage people to do that, with the exceptions you're talking about. Finally, if the this is a clarification from the city attorney, if the council chooses to say, well, we'd like to actually, we'll say, end the discussion period right now, although the mayor has chosen to extend it, and we need to vote on that, is that a majority vote or a supermajority?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I'm not sure I follow the context of your question. Are you talking about during a quasi-judicial hearing?
Well, if we have an objection to a ruling that the mayor makes, it's an exception to the established rules, and some council member says, no, I think we ought to follow the rules now and not allow this exception here, that becomes a council decision.
That's right.
Is that a majority only or a supermajority vote?
No, it's a majority vote.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think particularly the point that you made about comments that come up in hearing, and we've seen this regularly. Excuse me. We've seen it regularly where something comes up in a hearing and to see somebody light up and go, that's an important point, and I want to make a comment to that. So, and we didn't think about that in our meeting, and I think that area is one where we clearly want the full measure of public input, and so that's an area where I feel like if that a change is in order, and I'm open to hearing other suggestions from our council about how to streamline the process, but we don't want to miss those impromptu bits. I think that can be important contributions to a hearing. On the public comment piece, I think that there's the other side of that question is folks that come here to attend a hearing, and they're here for item 1. And somebody's loaded the hearing with public comment. I mean, and the gang injunction is our one instance, as Mr. Hart said, that where we saw it carried to a, and very effectively, mind you, it was an effective effort, but it blew out any. Let's say somebody who was there for item number 1 had to sit for 2 hours before, or longer, because usually it's about a half hour or whatever of the sort of getting things started. So they just had to sit an awfully long time before their turn came up. And that's an area where I have I feel like respect of folks that come here for meetings is something to keep in mind. So I'm more open to that sandwich of a particular period of public comment and doing an early and late piece. Again, subject to the discretion. There's always, I mean, again, if it's 4 more speakers or whatever for the mayor to accomplish the intent, great. But if it's a blowout, then I would like to have the ability to move the meeting along, because the public comment piece is, it's different than our full agenda. As to the big packages, we've had some folks, there's sort of even some particular folks that they just do it every time, where they come in with 20, 30 pages and want, and there's no way to get through that. At least if it's real material, in an hour or in the day of. So I think that is a real issue. I I want to be able to read everything that comes in, and somehow we need to be able to, at least maybe it's just it's part of the encourage of just going, if you want us to read a big package, you need to get it into us the week before.
Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I appreciate the work of the committee and Mr. Kahlon revising these guidelines. My experience is that this council is fair and is pretty lenient in the interpretation of the rules. So I'm not too concerned that we have to cross every T and dot every I today. I think we could probably just adopt these and everything would be fine. I did, however, I think I hear from the majority of my colleagues some concern about the idea of cutting off submission of comments on an item after the item is announced. And I think the mayor suggested perhaps changing that to, say, a couple minutes after the end of the staff report. I think that is one thing I can see in this that I think should be changed. But other than that, I would move adoption of these rules of procedure with that one change I just described.
Is that a motion? That's a motion?
That's a motion.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Mr. Rouse is seconding. Mr. Rouse?
Yes, I agree with Mr. Francisco in that. That's practically, in practice, what we do today is we have the staff report, and then before it comes to council is basically when we accept. So I think that can be an easy standard to adapt to. And also, in the submission of what, and Mr. Kahlon uses voluminous materials, and we've seen that a number of times, that is rather unfair to one side. If you're expected to have digested a 500-page architectural review when the other side has already had their materials in for a week or so ahead of time. So I think that there needs to be a cutoff. It should be in time of the distribution of the packet. I do not want to be responsible for having to review a large, thick report that's being brought in Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock for this meeting. So,
just to be clear, was the motion to adopt as presented, but also to amend the piece about public comment speakers still just a few minutes after the end of the staff report? Okay. Let me make some comments. I know some other lights are on, and again, first off, thank you to Mr. Kahlon and the committee. This is overdue and helpful, and I think, as was mentioned, we do what we can to move the meetings along as fair as we can, and having something in writing to help us with those guidelines is very helpful. If there are problems or the one exception to the rule, we can make these rules allow us to decide how to address those concerns. So I think that issue will work itself out. I think what was meant in terms of the big voluminous materials of packages is really about appeals, and the packages are by the either appellant or the applicant. And so, I think the wording is fine the way it is, and it gives us as council, it tells people, heads up, if you get it on Tuesday afternoon, it may not be used as part of the council's decision making, and that protects us. I would, and recommend that those who want to give us big pieces of materials, because after they read the staff report, to at least do it by Monday or something. But I think the way you have it written down gives that flexibility. You're not putting a hard line. There are big suggestions about actually being effective, and that's a lot of work putting those packets together. You want us to read them, right? So, and I never knew that the line at Trader Joe's was such a hotbed of civic activity, but apparently it is. So that's really good. But I do, and the issue about public comment, to have an option to the end of the meeting, actually I think broadens what's already there. We don't have that option right now. That would be something in addition to adding something to the agenda, which we can't do. So these rules allow us to give us that flexibility a little better. Personally, and I'm sure my successors will do the same thing. If we're at that 30-minute line and there's 2 or 3 people left, we're going to let those 2 or 3 people speak. We're not going to make them wait hours until the end of the meeting. I should note, in cities all across the country, a lot of city meetings start in the evening, and public comment is not until the very last item of the agenda, not the beginning, and sometimes it's midnight or 1 a.m. before you're even allowed to have public comment. So I think we do what we can to, be as transparent and open as much as we can. So, but this is a good way to, I'm going to have to reread the Rosenberg's. It's 7 pages, but it's really small font, so I just want to make sure that you did notice that, the Rosenberg's Rules of Order. But this is, I think, great work. Mr. Hotchkiss and Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Further, what you were saying about public comment, I think, as I recall in our discussions in the committee, we were, although acknowledging the point that Mr. Hart was making, that we wanted to be sure that the council was not taken advantage of, and that a meeting was hijacked by a particular interest group, but through public comment that went on forever, unfairly postponing already agendized items for which people had arrived to meet. So that was the rationale, and I think a correct one behind the recommendations that we've made and that the motion includes. And I just wanted to verify or to clarify, again, once something has come back to the council, that's it. Public discussion is not included unless somebody from the council asks for clarification from a member of the public. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to stand my ground on the item about requests to speak when they come in. I think sometimes during public comment on an item, someone else in the audience goes, "Oh, I want to make a comment about that public comment," and so then they get up and they hurry in with the slip. So if there's agreement here, if we're going to go with the motion, I'd like to pull that one out so I can vote against it. And I wanted to ask Councilmember Hart, since he had more objections than I do, if he wanted to vote separately. I don't like it sometimes when there's only a couple of things I don't like about a motion, and then I have to vote totally against everything when some of the stuff I did agree with. So if I could ask that to be considered. And then if I may ask Mr. Kahlon about calling the question. I think we do that sometimes when council member or two they're tired of the discussion and they say call the question. I don't think we do it correctly under Roberts. And what does Rosenberg say about that for our edification and that of the public? Please.
I'm going to go from my memory, which is dangerous, but it's essentially a motion to limit debate, and a motion to limit debate requires a second and a 2/3 vote.
Right. Okay. That's what I think we don't do. And I'm glad to be reminded that that's how we should close discussion. So,
and just to follow up from Ms. Murillo and her concern, I believe even though we might be changing the item about speaker slips, there's still discretion if something should happen and someone needs to submit a public comment speaker slip that the mayor could say, I'll let this one in or not. This is just, right? I mean, it's not.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I had drafted a quick change, and what I'm proposing to address the council's concern, and Councilmember Murillo's concern is included in that, would be to delete any reference to time from section 4.11 at all. So it simply requires a speaker slip. Leave it up to the council to decide when or whether to cut off submission of speaker slips.
Is that okay with the motion maker?
So basically 4.11 would, well, I think it's a slight difference from what the motion is, right? You're saying that it's just up to the discretion of the mayor when to cut off
right.
comment speaker slip times.
Right, and if you'd like, I can walk you through the exact language and we can be done with this. At page 14, it currently reads, any person wishing to address the city council should first complete and deliver to the city administrator, city clerk, a request to speak form prior to the time that the item on the agenda is initially read by the deputy city clerk. We would strike the word prior and the words time that the item on the agenda is initially read. So it would simply say any person wishing to address the city council should first complete and deliver to the city clerk a request to speak form
To the deputy city clerk.
Miss Period.
Oh, period.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Francisco is maker of the motion. Would you be okay with that?
Sure, that's okay.
Okay.
Yay, I can vote for
And Mr.
everything now.
Rouse?
Yeah.
Just a point of clarification, does that mean that during the council deliberations that,
No.
okay, that means we're still, so we're basically doing
We
what we
close
do
public comment.
anyway?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. All right. So we understand the amended motion. Mr. Hart?
So that was really helpful to see specifically where the language is. Can you go through where the language is regarding the second public comment period at the end of the meeting?
Happy to. Let me flip to it.
Page 15, 4.12.2.
Why, thank you, Mayor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also reflected in the pro forma agenda that's included. I'm trying to find that page.
Okay, I see that part. And then where is the specific language about submitting materials before the council agenda is posted?
3.1.4, or 3.4 rather, excuse me. And it's a should. Well, I've got the mic open if I might. It's not mandatory. It's a should. And it simply relieves the council of the obligation to consider. The other thing I'd add is that for the land use hearings where this typically happens, the appellant and applicant know weeks, if not months, in advance the date.
Right. No, I understand the intent, and it makes a lot of sense for big, voluminous things. It doesn't make sense, ironically, for everything else, which is 90% of the communications we get. And so having a rule for the 1% of the time, that same thing, frankly, applies to the second public comment period. You know, we just don't have this happen as a matter of course. Haven't had it happen except one time in my 10 years of being on the council. So having a rule that is constructed to address that 1% of the time is awkward, but it sounds like if there's enough discretion. And then where is the ex parte communication? Where's the language on that?
It's 4.14.5 on page 17.
Repeat that, please.
4.14.5 on page 17.
And that's should and discourage. Okay.
Okay. So the motion is to adopt this updated procedures with the strikeout language on page, 12? No, page 14, 4.11, as described by the city attorney about the public participation, right?
Yes,
Okay.
that was my motion, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Francisco, and thank you, Mr. Rouse. Okay, anything else to the motion or to the item? All those in favor?
Aye.
Great, that's unanimous. Thank you. All right, good work. Okay, item number 20.
Newly adopted medical marijuana legislation.
Okay. Ms. Ostrander, whenever you're ready.
Let me introduce this before Assistant City Attorney Ostrander gets into the meat of it. Around the middle of last month, the governor signed a package of marijuana regulation bills, medical marijuana regulation bills. And the reason we're here to you so quickly is that they really compel a policy choice for the council in a couple of areas. So we wanted to be timely with that, and that's why we've rushed this. I recognize, I say that really by way of apology because we don't have a policy recommendation formulated. I believe Mr. Casey has some ideas, but we've laid this in the council's lap in pretty loose form, and I did want to apologize for that.
Ms. Ostrander.
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Mayor, council members, Tava Ostrander, Assistant City Attorney. So as Mr. Kalan said, I'm going to be briefing you on a new legislation that was signed by the governor last month. It is collectively referred to as the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, or the acronym MRSA. It is comprised of three distinct pieces of legislation: Assembly Bill 266, Assembly Bill 243, and Senate Bill 643. It will become effective as of January 1st of 2016. What MRSA is a comprehensive bill that regulates not only medical marijuana dispensaries, but all commercial medical marijuana-related activity. It expands upon existing law that was established under the Compassionate Use Act and the Medical Marijuana Program Act that authorizes Californians to use marijuana for medical purposes and also provides a defense to the possession and collective cultivation or simply cultivation of marijuana by individuals with a marijuana recommendation or their primary caregivers. MRSA fills a void that was presently lacking in the legislation and the courts were attempting to fill, and that was with respect to what extent are local jurisdictions able to regulate or even ban marijuana dispensaries and medical marijuana-related commercial activities within their jurisdiction. This new bill is actually increasing and reinforcing local control and the local right to regulate medical marijuana. It's supported by the League of California Cities, both AB 266, AB 243, and Senate Bill 643. I'm going to give you a general summary of each one of these bills so you have an understanding of them. They are, as I said, very comprehensive bills, so it's just a general overview. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm going to start with Assembly Bill 266, and I start here because really this is the meat and potatoes of the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. It creates the broadest licensing scheme. It's going to license not only medical marijuana dispensaries, but also all those commercial-related activities. For example, it's going to regulate and license transportation, manufacture, testing of marijuana. The only thing this really doesn't cover is the licensing of cultivation, and I'll get to that later. It's covered under a different bill. It establishes the Bureau of Medical Marijuana and Regulations through the Department of Consumer Affairs. The role of BMMR will be to oversee the licensing and then also make sure that the regulations are being enforced. AB 266 also specifically allows local jurisdictions to completely ban medical marijuana dispensaries if that is their choice. But for those cities or local jurisdictions that do have a permitting ordinance in place or would like to permit medical marijuana dispensaries, it creates a dual licensing system between the state and these local governments. And how this is going to work is if a local jurisdiction has a permitting ordinance in place, a potential licensee is going to need to first obtain the local permit before it can even apply at the state level and obtain the state license. Once the state license is obtained, it's necessary that the licensee maintain in good standing both the local permit and the state license. If, for example, the local agency was to revoke or suspend the local permit, then so too would the state permit be suspended in that jurisdiction. And conversely, it would work the opposite direction. If the state were to revoke the permit, then that dispensary could no longer operate within the local jurisdiction. One of the interesting things that is going to be added that we haven't seen before is there's going to be minimum testing requirements and standards placed on all marijuana that's distributed to the public, whether in its original form, it could be in form of edibles, but these testing requirements are going to be done by state licensed facilities. These facilities cannot have a financial interest in any other commercial-related medical marijuana activity. The purpose of it is to create kind of a checks and balance and ensure a health and safety aspect to the extent that it's possible. Another important aspect of AB 266 that is affecting local jurisdictions is that under this new state licensing scheme, unless a local jurisdiction has an ordinance in place that prohibits or restricts the mobile delivery of medical marijuana, any state licensed dispensary can then deliver marijuana within that jurisdiction. So when can we expect this licensing? It's not going to be anytime soon. The state has indicated that the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulations is not going to be ready to issue permits until approximately January of 2018. So what this means for dispensaries that are presently permitted under local ordinances is that they're going to operate and can continue to operate in conformance with their local regulations exclusively under that local permit and without a state license until the state begins licensing these dispensaries. We turn next to Assembly Bill 243, which pertains mostly to cultivation of medical marijuana. AB 243 is an attempt to try and control the impacts that both indoor and outdoor cultivation have on the environment. For example, there's electrical uses, there's always the potential for water diversion, the use of pesticides, and the impacts on forestry. The Department of Food and Agriculture is going to be in charge of licensing and regulating these new regulations and impositions that will become in effect. One of the most important aspects that's causing a lot of concern and a lot of notice by cities throughout the state is a provision in AB 243 that provides that unless a local ordinance is in place regulating or banning cultivation before March 1st of 2016, the state will be the sole licensing authority and will have the sole ability to regulate the cultivation of marijuana. This is one of the few aspects of this collective legislation under MRSA that's actually kind of taking power away from local agencies unless they take a really proactive stance immediately. And this is something, one of the reasons, as Mr. Kahlon said, that we're bringing this attention to your attention so quickly. And the last and final piece of the legislation is Senate Bill 643. This bill probably has the least immediate impact on the city of Santa Barbara. Its primary concern is to impose greater oversight to physicians who are issuing medical marijuana recommendations. So, for example, it now provides that before a physician can issue a recommendation, he needs to first examine the patient. Failure to do so would be considered professional misconduct, and they could be subject to censure or discipline. It also prohibits physicians from having any financial interest in a dispensary or receiving any remuneration from a dispensary for making recommendations for medical marijuana. One of the most important aspects of this bill as it relates to cities and local jurisdictions is that it upholds the local power to levy fees and taxes for the sale of marijuana and other marijuana-related activities. At this point, Santa Barbara does have fees in place with respect to its dispensaries, but we do not at this point have sales tax. This piece of legislation would provide that opening in the future if it was something that the voters cared to.
Can I ask a question about that? Usually if there's a new tax, it has to go to a vote of the people. Is this that way, or is it separate, just adding it to the sales tax that's already in existence? Which way does that go?
Madam Mayor, council members, it does not take it outside that process. It will require a voter initiative. And finally, how does this impact the city and where are we with our own dispensary ordinance. Our ordinance that regulates medical marijuana storefront dispensaries is found in Chapter 2880 of the Zoning Code. Under our ordinance, we permit 3 dispensaries. We presently have 1 dispensary permitted. I don't believe it's operating yet, but it's permitted for operation on Upper State Street, and the zoning department at Community Development is reviewing 2 applications, one for Milpas and one for De La Vina. If these applications are approved or subsequent applications are approved, the dispensaries, these 3 dispensaries, will continue to operate until the state begins issuing licenses, at which time they'll be required to get a license, and if they can't get a license, they will not be able to operate within the city. Presently, our ordinance is not in conflict with the legislation, but it is distinctly silent on 2 important issues, and that's what we're bringing to you today. The city ordinance does not regulate cultivation, and nor does it regulate mobile delivery of marijuana. So unless the city creates an ordinance addressing either of these issues, at some point that I'll get into in a minute, the state will retain the right to regulate these issues. I wanted to speak first on cultivation because really this is the most urgent of the 2 matters. As I mentioned, under Assembly Bill 243, unless the city has an ordinance in place prior to March 1st regulating or prohibiting the cultivation of medical marijuana, the state will be the sole regulating authority, and the city will lose its opportunity to determine the type, size, location, generally where it wants these things. And I say this because the cultivation of marijuana is considered an agricultural activity, and under the city's zoning codes, agriculture is actually allowed in just about every zone of our city. So it could have a very pervasive effect if the city's just allowing it where our zoning code is going to allow it. You could see it in single-family homes, commercial districts, and obviously there's a secondary health and safety impact that might derive from that. So if council desires to maintain this local control over cultivation, really has 2 options. The first option, council could adopt a permanent ordinance that regulates or bans the cultivation of marijuana. This would unquestionably reserve our local power and local control over the issue. The only problem is that we are clearly under a compressed time frame to meet our March 1st deadline. So it's going to be necessary to adopt an ordinance by January 19th or as late as the following week if we adopt it as emergency legislation. Because we're in such a compressed time frame, obviously it's going to be a lot of effort on staff to create an ordinance that would have a comprehensive regulatory scheme. Prohibitory scheme would be probably easier to adopt. Alternatively, the city could adopt an emergency interim ordinance under the provisions of the government code that would allow us to establish a moratorium on cultivation for up to 1 year. This would allow staff to study the potential impacts to health and safety that the state legislation may have. It would be something that we could do quickly. The only concern with this is because it's a temporary prohibition and not an express land use regulation, the state could potentially argue that we didn't have a land use ordinance in place by March 1st, 2016, and that therefore they preempt and we are, as a city, unable to regulate cultivation.
On that issue, is this a zoning amendment requiring a supermajority vote?
Probably. I don't think you're necessarily compelled to do it that way, but given that the existing permitting structure is in the zoning title, it probably makes sense to stay there.
And remind me on moratoriums, does that also require more than a simple majority?
4/5 vote, if I recall correctly.
All right, thank you. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, Ms. Murillo, you had a question?
Yes,
Go ahead.
thank you. Thank you, Mayor Schneider. So I'm wondering what Proposition 215 said about cultivation by a patient and cultivation in a commercial sense. And I know there's some experts and some industry people in the audience if they have something to add during the public comment. Or I think there's a difference, right, for someone personally growing their medicine or somebody who wants to turn it into a business and do it commercially. And I don't know. I don't know how people grow it or where they do it.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, Assembly Bill 243 does carve out a provision for and allows for the personal cultivation of marijuana. It specifically provides that it cannot be over 500 feet and it's for personal consumption only. However, the AB 243 does specifically state that a city or local jurisdiction could opt through its land use controls to prohibit all cultivation, including cultivation for personal use.
You mean 500 square feet? When
Yes.
you said 500 feet?
500 square feet.
Plants aren't 500 feet.
Yeah, 500 square feet.
Okay, all right. That's it for one. Okay, got it. Thank you. Go ahead. Okay. Well, you can clarify that. Thanks. Thank you. Go ahead.
So those are the two options that council could consider with respect to cultivation. The other issue that we wanted to discuss is mobile delivery. It doesn't have the same urgency as cultivation because, as I just said earlier, really mobile delivery is going to be allowed under the state licensing scheme, and the state has indicated it's not going to be issuing licenses until approximately 2018. So we have a little time to consider this, but under this regulation, unless the city has an ordinance in place that either prohibits or somehow restricts mobile delivery of marijuana, it could potentially be receiving mobile deliveries from anywhere in the state. I would see them most likely coming from local cities and other counties. So with regards to mobile delivery, the city really has three options. It can choose to do nothing and allow state licensed dispensaries to deliver in the city. It could adopt an ordinance that limits delivery to only those city permitted dispensaries, or it could adopt an ordinance with an outright ban prohibiting all mobile delivery. So with this overview and the potential impacts that the city's facing as a result of the new legislation, the city attorney's office and the community development department was seeking immediate direction with respect to how council would like to proceed as to medical marijuana cultivation, and then get direction on whether or not council would like to regulate mobile delivery of medical marijuana.
So the mobile delivery piece, we have more time. We could do that separately from the cultivation ordinance in terms of if there's more conversation about that. Is that correct?
That's correct, Madam Mayor.
And we do not have a meeting on January 19th, if I'm recalling correctly. So January 12th is the swearing-in day. Mr. Dominguez, Councilmember-elect, is going to have a fun first day in office or something, but perhaps. But you could do something the following week and still, because it has to be in place. You need the 30 days.
If it was under the January, I think that's January 23rd, if it would have to be an emergency ordinance, because then it would be enacted the same day it was adopted.
Okay, well, that's logistics. But for today, you're just asking us whether or not the council directions is to move forward with something, and then we can figure out what the something is. Or do you want us to say today whether or not we should go with the permanent or interim ordinance? I mean, do we have to make that decision right here, right now?
Madam Mayor, the League of California Cities is cautioning that there's a significant amount of risk that goes with using an urgency ordinance, a moratorium approach. So it would be imprudent from my point of view to go down that path. That means we would be getting to work immediately to get this back to you in time for council action in January.
Okay. Questions, Mr. Hart?
Is there a strategy where we do one thing kind of coarsely now to meet these deadlines and then have more time to have a more deliberative process and amend that direction at a future point?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hart, yes. The cultivation is a complex issue. There are patients' interests to be taken into account, I'm sure. So an outright ban would be the simplest thing to do in the short term, followed by a direction of staff to study the appropriate circumstances and locations for cultivation.
And that second follow-up legislative action isn't? It would be outside of that time constraint that the state has imposed?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you. So, Ms. Ostringer, can you go back one slide, please? What are the city's options? So do nothing, let the state regulate it, adopt an ordinance limiting it to only the dispensaries that are permitted, or prohibit it. I think there's another option there. Well, I don't like number 2 because that would limit competition if only the permitted ones could deliver, right? So can we regulate if people are making deliveries, if there's a dispensary in Goleta, which I know there is, that would deliver into the city limits? So that's another option, right? Or am I missing something, Mr.? But
item 1.
Item 1,
and that
but
one doesn't have the same time constraint as the
I know,
others.
but sometimes the state allows things, Punta Gorda, those little houses. I mean, we don't really. If we were trying to not, we don't always trust the state, right? So, no offense. So, is there a way to ask the outside dispensaries delivering into the city to get a business license from us, and we could try to control what they do?
If they were going to be delivering within the city, we would want a business license. I suppose there could be a finding that would limit it to some sort of finding that would limit it to the reason why it would be dispensaries located only with, say, the Santa Barbara County.
Juan?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, you could probably pick a radius, number of miles, if you wanted to do that. Enforceability gets to be a real problem when you go beyond the permitted dispensaries that your ordinance allows currently.
You mean because vans or whatever, or cars will be coming in and we don't know they're delivering, kind of thing?
I don't want to be a scaremonger whether we'll have vans and coming in, but yeah, I think there'll be a market here.
Motorcycle? Okay. We'll wait until maybe someone from the audience can give us more information. Thank you.
Mr. Rouse, question? Yep.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Ms. Ostringer, are there, under the Compassionate Use Act, we talked about closed-loop collectives, we talked about amounts, we talked about usages, and then now we're talking about cultivation and delivery. Do any of those amounts or those limitations or the numbers of members apply here, or is this going to be open retail? Or I'm not sure I quite understand the distinction between the Compassionate Use Act that's established now and this new attempt to regulate the dispensary operation.
Once the state begins permitting dispensaries, the requirement for collective cultivation is no longer a requirement. It's no longer a defense to criminal prosecution. They may dispense more like a retail organization.
And would the retail be specifically for medical purposes, or would it be for general purposes?
It would be for only with people with medical marijuana recommendations from their physicians.
And the physician then, according to SB 643, would have to provide an examination to qualify somebody as a member.
Yes.
But is the examination, is it identified or is it defined, or is that strictly a physician discretion at this point in time?
I believe it's just defined as a physician examination.
Okay, but that could be an interview, it could be physical, it could be, we don't know. So, all right. Thank you.
Mr. Hart?
There are efforts underway to put a measure on the ballot in 2016 to legalize recreational use of marijuana. Has the League of Cities, or have you had a chance to even know anything about that and how that might, if it was successful, affect any of what we're talking about now?
No.
Do you know if they've even been submitted to the Attorney General for a title and summary?
I don't believe they have.
Okay, let's go to public comment. So we start with, is it Erie? Bjorklund, be followed by Dr. David Bierman. Is Erie here? Great. Yep.
Well, Mayor Schneider, the rest of the council. There's one point of interest that I've heard today that's pretty of quite interest to myself, and that is the local permits that will be issued to produce or cultivate medical marijuana. I think that we will need to look at what the city will be needing in terms of volume and what the current producers are capable of producing in terms of volume. I believe that if there's additional permits are to be issued, that they should follow up what's currently available to us. And that's what I've come up with today that I would like to talk about. I just received notice of this meeting last night through the newspaper, so I'm not totally prepared, but I'm glad to be here and get caught up on where the council is going with this. And I look forward to being able to talk with you again in the future and providing more information. If there's anybody that has any questions to a medical marijuana provider, I would like to address that at this time if there's anything.
Thank you. We'll certainly keep you up to date if this goes forward. I'm about keeping you informed of the meetings. So.
Okay.
Did you have a question, Mr. White, actually? No, it's okay. Okay. Thank you. A couple people are waiving their time to Dr. Bierman. Andrew Kwok, are you here? And then Crystal Padilla. Okay. So you have up to 6 minutes.
Andrew has given me his time.
Yes, I just.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, it's a pleasure to be here. I must say that I'm rather satisfied with what the state has done. I've been in practice in Isla Vista, Goleta, Santa Barbara from 1970 to the present, except for the period from 1975 to 1983. I've been practicing cannabinoid medicine since 2001. My first office was on Mitchell-Terena Street. I've seen over 3,000 patients with such conditions as multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, other neurodegenerative diseases, quadriplegics, paraplegics, amputees, cancer patients, people with PTSD, attention deficit disorder, Asperger's syndrome, autism, and other serious medical conditions. These are patients from all walks of life. I've seen doctors, lawyers, deputy sheriffs, entrepreneurs, and the homeless. These people are our neighbors. They have illnesses that you and I may get or may already have. They deserve to be treated like patients, not pariahs. If I had my way, we'd go back to when my father was a pharmacist, when he started pharmacy school in 1928, and have this dispensed from drugstores, which is where I think it belongs. Cannabis, as Dr. Donald Abrams, who's an oncologist at UCSF, has said, has been a medicine for 5,000 years, except for the period from 1942 through 1996. As far as cultivation, the state has done a lot of work for you. It seems to me that what you can do is to allow cultivation for personal use. I mean, this is a country that prides itself on personal responsibility and rugged individualism. This way, the person knows exactly what they're getting. It's very helpful to low-income people. We don't have to pad the pockets of big pharma or big cannabis, for that matter. So the state recognizes this distinction between personal and commercial. A person can grow 100 square feet, and a small collective is allowed up to 5 people, and that's the 500 square feet that the assistant city attorney was referencing. It seems to me that if you're going to have commercial grows, that they need to be in industrial areas. I personally see no reason to get people upset about their neighbor renting out their rental property for a commercial grow. Commercial grows should be in an industrial setting. They should be required to have a business license, and I don't see any particular problem with having a reasonable tax on their activity. In terms of delivery services, first off, I think that the city has been very restrictive in terms of the number of dispensaries that are permitted. At one time, there were 21 dispensaries in the city. There's now 3. To limit the deliveries to only those dispensaries that are permitted by ordinance makes it very inconvenient for somebody who is in a wheelchair, somebody who has a working family that's caring for them, to travel to these 3 dispensaries. It seems to me that you should consider having more. That said, the delivery service is important to people that are ill. Now, what you might want to do is to require that the drivers of these delivery vehicles be of a certain age, say 25. If you want to go further, you might suggest that they pass a test that shows that they know something about the medicinal use of cannabis so that they can provide that information to the patient. Also, since I'm up here giving free advice, I sent you some letters before suggesting that you require that the manager of a dispensary be a nurse or a pharmacist. I have complaints from my patients who are sick who say, you know, I went into it. A woman the other day, yesterday, I think, whose husband is a prominent attorney in town, said I went into a dispensary and this kid didn't know what I wanted, wasn't able to respond to my medicinal concerns. That could be taken care of by requiring the dispensaries to have a pharmacist or a nurse be in charge. One last thing, I think that you need to keep in mind that these patients are ill and are using a medicine that has been around for 5,000 years and was in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1854 until 1942, and which American physicians in the 1920s, when we still relied on plant-based medicines and herbal medicine, wrote 3 million prescriptions a year that contain cannabis. One suggestion would be, in terms of looking at this, you have a committee called the Measure P Committee, on which I have sat for many years, and which, to the credit of the police department, we have not met for quite a while because we have not needed to. But you have a group of people on that committee who are aware, who do have some civic involvement, that might serve as a group to provide you some advice on this. And there are other people in town who are knowledgeable. Granted, some people do have a stake in this. And in regards to the question that Councilman Rouse asked regarding the nature of the physical examination, several years ago, I was the co-founder of the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine. I've got 10 seconds left. And we set down certain standards, and you might want to take a look at the standards by which physicians are practicing, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Madam Mayor.
Mr. Hart and then Ms. Murillo. And then Phil Walker will be the final speaker.
Dr. Bierman, do you have any knowledge about the status of the state legislative efforts or the initiative efforts at the state level to legalize recreational marijuana, and what is being discussed about the language in those efforts that would impact what we're doing here?
I don't have anything specific. I do know that some months ago, in an informal discussion with Assemblyman Williams, in which I was actually asking for action to make opiates more available for people in chronic pain, he said, don't waste your breath. We're not going to do anything about that. But the state legislature is going to legalize marijuana for recreational use before the end of 2016. That's all that I know. Now, in regards to a question that you asked earlier of your staff, one of the reasons that your city attorney couldn't answer is there are at least 6 initiatives that are circulating, and they're all a little bit different. Right. I do think that they need to be watched closely, and it seems to me that you will have at least one and maybe more initiatives on the ballot, on top of the possibility that the state legislature will legalize it. But I don't think that they have taken any specific action at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Muriel?
Thank you. So, Dr. Bierman, in terms of cultivation, because that's the item that has a little more urgency, so some people grow it for themselves and some people are too ill to. Is that the case?
Yes, that's correct. You know, I mean, I have people who clearly can't grow. I mean, a quadriplegic. There was elderly people who have lady had osteoporosis. So oftentimes these people become part of a small collective, and the state legislature allows for collectives of up to 5 people, and they can have 500 square feet. The figure of 100 square feet came from Chris Conrad, who is a grow expert. He's testified in court many times on grows, and when this was first legalized, he recommended a canopy of 100 square feet. So I think that most people would say that 100 square feet is reasonable. And also gardening, it's true that there are people that need to be part of collectives because they can't do it, but people who have serious problems but can do it, gardening can be very therapeutic.
Okay. I have a concern about our housing situation where someone might try and turn a house all into a grow house. And I don't know if my fear is unfounded, but I know that with vacation rentals, once someone got a hold of something that made a lot of money, it kind of got out of control. So where do people, do they grow indoors, the people who provide to dispensaries? I assume so.
That provide to dispensaries? No, they rarely do that. I do expert witness work, and there was only one case that I was involved with where there were commercial grows in houses, but I do know that that happens. Individual patients will often take a closet and turn that into a grow space, but I think by making it zoning out residential places for commercial use would certainly discourage it, would make it just as illegal, if not more so, than it is now. And I think that's an appropriate action for this council to take if you so choose.
Okay, thank you.
And so just to clarify, the law states the amount of space for a collective, which is not a commercial activity in the way that Councilmember Murillo was concerned about. You're not providing 500 square feet for cultivation to as a commercial enterprise. It's a collective for the people involved in the collective. I mean, there are very specific rules about the access to the medicinal marijuana in a collective.
Right. What I said earlier is that if you have a commercial grow, it should be in an industrial area.
Right.
But I do think that if you saw some of the patients that I see, people are being very helpful to them, and oftentimes it's a family member that themselves may have a lesser illness and they're growing for themselves or maybe for their spouse and also for their aged parent. That's the kind of thing that I have in mind, not somebody who's saying, oh, hey, I can make some extra money by selling this to one of the 3 dispensaries that is approved by the city.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Boomerang. And then Phil Walker.
It's very interesting. Good afternoon once again, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. I have no problem with medical marijuana since May 19th, 2009, when I had the subcortical brain hemorrhage. Somehow the memory of a earlier 1996 vehicle impact trauma came back in the left hip and leg, and I've been dealing with pain every day since then. Fortunately, it doesn't impact my sleep. But, you know, the Dr. Philip DeLeo is now chief of neurology at Cottage, said, you might want to try this. It's called gabapentin. Okay, common side effects: sleepiness, dizziness, feeling uncoordinated, unusual tiredness or weakness, pendular or jerky eye movement. That can get you in trouble driving. Nasal congestion, shakiness, visual disturbances, weight gain, inflammation of the pharynx. You can choke to death, I guess. Itching, back pain, cough, constipation, depression, dry mouth, indigestion, impotence, muscle pain, nervousness, swelling of the extremities. So, you know, I get by on Safeway, generic acetaminophen, and I've been able to get by on it, but I have no problem with having a dispensary next door if it needs be, because a lot of people are suffering from chronic, mild to extreme pain. And I just got a problem with bureaucracies and having family members who live right around the corner from the Green Valley Sycamore Vista development. They got great foundations there, perimeter foundations, but that's what can happen when the state delves further and further into control in people's lives. Also, 49 years ago to the day today, November 10th, I was inducted November 7th, 1966. There was no control. You just got in the shot line with a medic on each arm with the pneumatic shotguns. That's called lack of control. Hopefully you'll impart a little bit of control into this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes public comment. It's to the council. I'll go ahead, Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, it seems to me we definitely don't want the state of California regulating any more business than they have to. And it also seems to me that there are existing regulations in place for individuals to grow medical marijuana for their own use. So really what we're talking about when we talk about cultivation, which is the only urgent issue before us, is commercial cultivation. That's the only thing that could happen and that would need to be regulated, I think, like any other zoning, like any other land use. And as the speaker pointed out, commercial grows are large operations typically. And it's, I mean, we would be very careful about, I don't know what our zoning is for greenhouses in the city. Somebody could enlighten me on that. But it's that kind of commercial operation. I think we would want to be very careful about where such things could be allowed, if they're allowed at all. So that seems to me, I don't know where the majority of council is on this, but if we were to allow cultivation at all, it seems like it would have to be very restrictive in the areas in which it could be allowed.
Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, whenever we get into the subject, it seems like we drift off into the efficacy and the needs and things really what we're not talking about today. We've got a responsibility to the city to take whatever action we can to maintain and retain as much local control as possible. Clearly, the state hasn't been our buddy in a lot of issues lately, and having another state finger into our pie is not exactly in the best interest of Santa Barbara. When it comes to cultivation, I think that the only logical move, given the time constraints and given the possibilities of the state reaching in for control, is to have an absolute ban voted on now. And like Mr. Kalan explained, we can talk about other issues later on, but we need to get this done in a timely manner. Transportation and delivery, Those are issues that can happen, but we don't want to. We want to contain what's within our city. If you're going to license and permit 3 dispensaries, which we've decided, our council's decided to do, then the least we could do is let those businesses function and protect them and allow them to run the deliveries, allow us to control them, and allow us to be able to audit and to potentially tax or create fees to help. And I don't know. I think under 643, I think there's the ability to do that. So I think that we need to act in the interest of the city. We need to act quickly instead of later, clearly, because of the ordinance process. But I don't think we should try to parse and get too cute here at this particular juncture. I think we need to be very firm and very clear on what we want to do and maintain as much local control as possible. And I was going to ask Ms. Ostringer or maybe Mr. Casey about if we do these things, if we have these dispensaries and we do have delivery and we do want to control or to track or to tax, is there a fee structure or is there a method by which a fee structure can be developed?
Madam Mayor, council members, there are a few cities that have already established taxing procedures on medical marijuana dispensaries. I think gross sales is something that they've used as a measure. That's something we could look at more carefully and bring that back to you if it's of interest to the council, and then ultimately would require you to place it on the ballot for a tax measure if that's where you're thinking.
Because it seems to me that auditing is going to be very important to control this, so we don't go back to the Wild West mentality that we had before. As the doctor said, we had 23 dispensaries before. We had very little control. If we're going to be serious about this, and we really are going to regulate it, we have an ordinance developed about it. And we want to control this locally and not have other interests from the outside of the city. I think it's really important that we do this definitively and we do it quickly. And that I'll be listening to what my colleagues have to say about it, but I'll be prepared to give some staff direction at the end of the deliberations.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Madam Mayor, to Mr. Rouse, your total ban, how does personal use or collective cultivation work on that?
Mr. Rouse?
I think it's a black or white issue, at least from the get-go. I think that it has to be a total, as I understand, as the regulation came down from the state, any parsing or any half measure could then be interpreted by the state as not a measure or a zoning measure at all, and we may lose all control. So at least from the get-go, I think we need to, and Ms. Ostringer, correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding of how this works, but for the initial ordinance, which is a land use issue, we need to basically say either there's cultivation or there's not cultivation. Am I correct in that?
It says that there has to be an express land use regulation in place or a conditional permitting process in place.
And if we were to allow, as Mr. Hotchkiss was talking about, personal cultivation, then that would require either a zoning issue, or that would require some type of either commercial, residential, zoning, some kind of permitting thing. And once again, we're going to get into a situation where now we're growing in neighborhoods. Not that it doesn't exist now, but I think for the purposes of this going forward, as I understand it, in order to maintain our control, we better be definitive about our land use direction. Do I understand that correctly?
The way I read the statute, we could technically carve out something for personal use, but it would be more difficult, particularly with respect to our zoning ordinance. Look to Mr. Kalan if he...
Well, again, if the council wants to regulate cultivation, I would recommend an interim ban, but done through a regular ordinance. Then you could task your community development department or a citizens group, however you wanted to do it, with the job of figuring out how to authorize appropriate personal grows.
I realize you do have the floor, Ms. Hotchkiss, but if I could ask Mr. Colon, so So that would at least buy some time for the deliberative process, but protect us from the state usurping our land use issue.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss, it's to the council. Mr. Hotchkiss, go ahead.
So if I understand right, then if we did a ban, or as you recommend now, there would be room for personal use down the line when we brought it as an ordinance. Am I correct? Or is that opening a door we shouldn't open?
No, again, the council, I believe the council would be free to roll back a very restrictive regulation after you'd had a chance to have more study on the issue.
Just to clarify, I thought I heard the state law has a carve out for personal use and a collective of up to 500 square feet. Anyway, irregardless.
It's not for collective. It's specifically for it's specifically for personal use. But that if the city's going to ban it and it chooses to ban it across the board, then that regulation or that exception would not apply.
So you could have an option of banning it, except for the personal use, as was described earlier, and as a collective up to 500 square feet. Could that be another way of looking at this? And then if you wanted to expand it even more later, you could.
Yes, I question our practical ability to develop that kind of regulation in the time we have, though. That's the caution I'm offering.
Okay. Dr. Bierman, it's to the council at this point, so we're not making a decision on what it's going to be, but I know if one of us wants to ask you a question, that's fine. You were in the room. We just adopted new rules, so it's to the council. Mr. Hotchkiss, did you have anything else? Okay. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. What I'm seeing is that adopting an emergency interim ordinance doesn't really give us security. The state or someone would argue that the temporary measure doesn't qualify. So I think the assurances you're looking for, Councilmember Rouse, are in us wrestling with this today and perhaps recognizing what I would argue is this city, the electorate of this city has said they didn't want to ban dispensaries. I think that was Measure T. Measure P was to make personal use the lowest priority in our law enforcement operations. Statewide 215, the state of California said, let's recognize marijuana as a medicine. So why don't we think along the lines of, I think what I heard was now it's agriculture, it's allowed. There are people right now who are growing their own marijuana as medicine, and I think that's the way to go rather than the dispensaries and the commercial operation of it. I think that's healthy, that they're growing their own herbal remedy to their problems, to their medical problems. I think we can direct our staff today to say residential personal use is fine, but draw us up some regulations related to commercial and limit it to the M1 zone. And just say that it has to be in the industrial zone, not even commercial, because I think that kind of bleeds over into a lot of different areas. Be very restrictive about it. I'm not sure how much I support commercial growing and the profit making of this. That would be my suggestion, and I think I'm reflecting what you were saying, Councilmember Francisco.
I actually had a question for Mr. Kahlon, just to clarify this. Do we have any provision, I was just looking for this, in the municipal code in the section about marijuana? Do we have anything about personal cultivation now?
Councilmember Francisco, Madam Mayor. No, we don't. There is one section that simply provides that dispensaries members must cultivate within the counties of Santa Barbara, Ventura, and San Luis Obispo.
Okay.
Well, I think Council Murillo is right in her philosophic approach to this, that people have the ability now to cultivate marijuana for their personal medical use, and we need to start from that principle going forward. And I think that there is reasonable way to regulate commercial activity and have that be in the appropriate zone. But I can't see the city of Santa Barbara stepping into severing that that right for folks who need medical marijuana. It doesn't make any sense. I think that it's wise that the city attorney's brought this issue to our attention, but I also think that events are going to take place at the state level to legalize marijuana in a much more comprehensive way between now and the time the state issues these regulations. I don't know what form that's going to take, and I think the only reason that probably wouldn't pass is that there is an argument amongst the proponents about what specifically gets on the ballot, like I think happened in Ohio. I think that there is a consensus in the state to legalize marijuana, and if it's done in a smart way, I think the voters will approve it. But I just don't. This feels a little bit like what we just did with the council procedures, where we're trying to imagine every scenario where there is a potential negative impact, and that has occurred with vacation rentals, and we didn't anticipate that, so it's smart to be open to that potential, but we also have to be careful not to overstep on the side of regulation and take away people's ability to get the medicine that they need in our concern out of some future potential threat that doesn't actually exist today.
I would agree there's a difference between a personal use and the collective as already prescribed in the state law versus commercial use. And so I think it goes close, I think, to what Mr. Rouse, what you're trying to say here is that an interim ordinance, a moratorium is risky. I don't think we want to go in that direction. So we need to do a regular ordinance and then give ourselves some breathing room if we want to expand things a bit. But I think instead of an all-out ban, is to limit it to personal use or the collective for up to 500 square feet as the state law carves out, and just put it there. And then don't even worry about the commercial stuff for now, and we can figure that out when we look at the other ordinance, which is about delivery service, because that issue will then come up, and we'll have the time to really go over all the different permutations. But I think because of the time crunch, as Mr. Hart was saying, I think we don't want to backtrack of what the intent of medical marijuana is, which is for personal use as a collective, and that's been all the meetings we had about our dispensaries was making a big distinction between a money-making operation versus a collective process for medicinal use. So I think that can get to the heart of what you're talking about, Mr. Rouse, and wanting to keep local control without placing an undue burden on people who are currently cultivating for their own personal use, which is happening anyway. So that might be the easiest way to go under the time constraint. So, Mr. Rouse, you have your light on?
Well, so, Mr. Colon, if we are to, number one, if we had an ordinance that was not as simple as an outright ban, we have to craft that now and here today. Is that correct?
Well, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, yes, we would need enough direction to get an ordinance drafted in the next week to make this happen.
And if we use language like personal use or collective, are we talking about a zoning or location issue, or is it a land use issue, or are they two different issues?
Well, I think that if I welcome help from Mr. Buell or Mr. Cotto from the Community Development Department, but I think that we would be distinguishing residential from commercial. I think we would assume that personal use equates with residential grows, and we would probably try and put a quantitative limit on the amount that you could grow in a residential zone and prohibit it in all other zoning districts.
So even if you lived in the C2 or CM, you would be prohibited from growing for personal use.
Well,
we're going to get into this, but my point is this, is that we are going back to the efficacy issue and whatnot again, I think. And really what we're trying to do is maintain as much local control as possible. And I think if I understand what's before us today, if we get too cute with this and get too complex with this, we may run the risk of losing our ability to control the outcome at the end.
Well, it's hard to respond because I don't want to characterize what the council's doing as being too cute or too clever. But having said that, it's going to be extremely difficult to have fine degrees of regulation and do it right the first time.
Right, my point. So,
But I think to your point is we can still do something that is very restrictive, give ourselves the opportunity to keep local control, and there's always an opportunity to amend an ordinance in the future and go through the longer process. The issue is the state gave us this ridiculous tight deadline to get, or we lose our local control. But that doesn't mean we should necessarily just completely ban it when it's already in place now where people are cultivating for personal use. So you want to restrict it as tight as you can. That makes sense. I think there's a difference between commercial use and personal medicinal use, and then give ourselves the time when we're going through the process under delivery services. If we wanted to go beyond that, the council at that time could, or it could just stay at that very restrictive level at that point. I don't think going through what I'm suggesting or what was being suggested is going to limit our local control, because we'll be going through the process as prescribed by the state law. So,
right, and I don't intend to try to go in and spy on and influence people's personal habits or their personal uses. But the other side of the coin is not 100% of the people who live in these neighborhoods are in favor of having grows and uses next to them like that. So I think we owe it to afford the maximum protection and sanctity of neighborhoods as possible to the level that we can. So like I said, I think it's going to be hard to parse that and just say, in this zone but not that zone, you can do it here but not over there, and protect ourselves for the maximum protection of the city.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm wondering if we have a consensus here that starts with the issue that basically you assembled. I don't know whether there's we could get all of us behind. For example, I don't see it as that complicated to zone personal use in the residential zones, and I think that there's some real loss. You mentioned the point of, there are lots of people living in the commercial zone. You're advocating devilishly on that, and I think that you're right. There are going to be people living there that will not be able to grow. Now, how much land is there? Of course, there'd be what closet wouldn't be available, et cetera. So there would be a loss that then would be part of the coming back, and so the ban would be more restrictive than perhaps the city would want to do long term. But at least it's grabbing the control that you're speaking of, and yet we're leaving this bit of this personal piece out there in the residential zones. And I think that, and obviously we have a number of folks on this council who are at least behind that, if not more. But there may be a consensus there to go with that. And then as far as the agricultural component, well, agriculture tends to be grown to happen in agricultural areas, and that's would be on the peripheries. I mean, you look at where the avocado orchards and such, right? Okay, but that's another conversation for another time, and that the personal grow in the residential zone, is that exactly what we want? No, but it's accomplishing this sort of on the fly. I've seen and I've heard Mr. Klon even being uncomfortable with that much finesse at this point. But I'm hoping that much arm twisting could go on with our council to say that's possible, to zone that, to put that in as a permitted use in the residential zones for the moment. And this would be then at least pushing back and maintaining control on the larger operations. I mean, we talk about this, the collectives and all that. Well, what I was hearing, is it Ms. Ostrander or Ostrander? I thought it was Ostrander. Okay. Say that what the state law is doing is it's converting the dispensaries into profit-making facilities at this point. Am I mistaken
I
on
wouldn't
that?
necessarily profit making, but it's taking away that collective cultivation aspect of it necessarily. And it's instead of making it an offense, it's decriminalizing the dispensing of medical marijuana and
So
cultivation.
it's decriminalizing the profit-making aspect of it. Would that be another way to put it?
I do believe it still has a nonprofit aspect to it, but I'm not going to.
The bookkeepers have to be a little busier, perhaps. Okay. Anyway, back to I'm saying the residential. I'm hoping that would be a piece where the ban goes on for the commercial, for even the personal use in the commercial zone, and that if we do it in the residential zone, that's carving out a big enough piece that we are coming closer to a consensus on this council.
Mr. Hart?
Well, I think it's going to take 5 votes to do something, and I think some of the constraint that we're feeling is the fact that we don't have meetings in late December and early January. So I think this is important enough that if we're going to go down the path of having the attorneys try and craft something that was going to require some discussion up here, we should put it into the mix that we could have meetings when we weren't originally going to schedule meetings. I mean, it's uncomfortable, but it's what we need to do, because it can be done. It's just hard, and this is not an easy thing to do.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Mr. Francisco.
I think
did
that
you have
there's-
something, Mr. Klon, or did you? I'm sorry.
Well, I can wait for Councilmember Francisco.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Francisco.
Madam Mayor, I think there's a fairly straightforward solution here, and that is, I think there's consensus on this council, whatever you believe about medical marijuana, I think there's a consensus that personal cultivation for people with a medical marijuana license should be allowed. And that does not mean that you can, plant your backyard full of marijuana and sell 90% of it. Obviously not. We're not, I don't think anybody thinks that we should be okaying commercial operations of any kind in residential zones. But I think there's a consensus that, given the state of things, someone with a medical marijuana license should be able to cultivate some small number of plants, and I'm sure our attorneys and our community development people can come up with something. I'm sure other cities have faced this. Some definition of a small enough amount that it is plausible for personal use only for people with a medically diagnosed condition. And then just outright ban on any other cultivation for commercial purposes, period. That would be very simple, and we would probably never need to change it, because I doubt that we will ever see a compelling need to have large-scale commercial cultivation of marijuana in town, just as we don't have large-scale whiskey production or large-scale other sorts of commercial ventures. So if it's, I think there might be consensus on council for something as simple as that. Create an ordinance that allows for cultivation for personal use for people with a medical marijuana license, ban all other commercial production.
Ms. Muriel?
May I hear from the city attorney? I'm dying to hear what he has to say.
Okay.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, thank you. I think you have 2 of the 3 pieces that you need to give us direction. Piece 1 is the what, and that's personal use, personal cultivation for personal use. Piece 2 is the where, and you've identified residential zoning districts. The third piece is how much. And so it would be helpful, even essential, to have the council say, are we talking about 6 plants, 12 plants, 10 square feet, some quantitative boundary, and then we could write a regulation.
Would as I'm understanding the state law, just go amongst with what the state law provides? It's 100 square feet per personal use, and then I guess the question is, if you allow a collective for reasons that were stated earlier, of people who have a card but can't personally cultivate themselves as a collective. Does that complicate things more? It just seems like if it's taken straight out of the state law, that's what we're allowing. End of story. That seems kind of simple.
I have the state law here if you'd like me to let you know what that is.
Okay, that would be good.
It provides that a qualified patient may cultivate marijuana if the area he or she uses to cultivate marijuana does not exceed 100 square feet, and he or she does not cultivate marijuana for his or her, who cultivates marijuana for his or her personal medical use, does not sell, distribute, donate, or provide marijuana to any other person or entity. And then it goes on to allow a primary caregiver to cultivate for up to 500 square feet if he or she cultivates exclusively for the medical and personal use of 5 specified qualified patients.
So why don't we just take the state language right there, put it in our ordinance saying that's what's allowed, everything else is banned?
Madam Mayor, the one consideration, I don't think the caregiver 500 square feet is consistent with what I'm hearing from your colleagues. And then secondly, is 100 square feet too big? I think if you wrestle those two questions.
Okay. So I guess just to my I'm trying to keep it simple because of the time constraints of the ordinance, right? So there's language that's already been vetted through the state, whether it's consistent, and then if we wanted to change it in the future, we could. I guess the question then is, as Mr. Kalan said, if the square footage maximum should be reduced, or if the and the primary care provider piece. Mr. Hotchkiss and Ms. Murillo.
It was my turn.
I'm sorry, Ms. Murillo. Go ahead. You're right.
Thank you. We didn't hear from Mr. Cato, and you had said, why don't we hear from community development? Because I would still like to argue for talking about allowing something in the manufacturing zone. He doesn't want to come up. Okay, that's fine. But what? He shook his head.
Madam Mayor, on Mr. Cato's defense, it's a policy question for you all. I'm not sure there's much more for planning staff to add at this point. I think you're narrowing in on a recommendation, and it's kind of judgment policy calls.
Well, Mr. Casey, while you're at the microphone then, do we hear complaints from our residents that somebody is growing 100 square feet of marijuana in their home and there's problems? I'm on the council. I've never heard a complaint about anybody growing weed or marijuana or smoking it. I don't hear complaints. Well, street people on State Street, I hear that, and on Milpa Street, but not related to medicine. Do we hear complaints?
No, Madam Mayor, I don't, and Councilmember, I don't think we've had many complaints in that regard.
Okay, then what I would like is 100 square feet for someone who has a prescription in the residential area, and if their home so happens to be in a commercial zone, which sometimes is down there in the Lower East Side, right, if I'm thinking correctly, then they should be allowed to grow it if they live in a single-family home, and it just so happens to be next to Marburg or whatever. And I don't think I totally trust our staff to be able to write this legislation within a short time. I know it's not going to be easy. And I'd like to stick to allowing it in the manufacturing zone. There's not a lot of houses down there, and that would be the place if we allow it. And we get ahead of the state. I'm just going to stand my ground, but if you all just want to go for residential personal use, I think I see people moving in that direction.
Okay, we have more lights on. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you. To satisfy your curiosity, why don't you make a motion and see if you have a second, Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Mr. Hotchkiss. I move that we direct staff to develop an ordinance allowing marijuana cultivation in the residential zone for people who have a prescription, and also to allow commercial growing in the manufacturing zone.
There's a second.
I thought you were going to second me, Mr. Hotchkiss. That's why you asked me. I know. I'm joking.
Thank you.
Is your intent to just allow people who live in the commercial zones to grow for personal use, or is it to allow commercial growing?
Sorry, say that again.
Is your intent, but the words you used said to allow commercial cultivation in the commercial zones. Did you mean to say personal use for people who live in the commercial zone?
No, I was talking about commercial growing in the manufacturing zone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a second?
So that's why, okay.
Okay, that dies for lack of a second.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yes, Mr. Hotchkiss, go ahead.
I guess I still have the floor. Then I would like to make the motion that we allow 100 square feet for personal medical use, no commercial growing anywhere, and that it be restricted to residential zones in the city. Does that cover all three of your requirements, Mr. Colon?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, yeah, I think we can work with that.
Okay, then that's my motion.
There's a second. Can you repeat the motion again? I'm sorry. It's up to 100
Can we
square feet
up
for
to 100
personal
square
medical use,
feet for-
no commercial cultivation, and only in residential zones.
Correct.
I'll second that.
Okay. There's a second. So it's to the motion.
I'll speak to
Go
the
ahead.
motion.
Go ahead, Mr.
I would
Hart.
support the motion if it was amended to allow for personal use in the commercial zones and not continue to prohibit commercial cultivation. But I just don't. I think there's a lot of residential neighborhoods in commercial zones in the city of Santa Barbara, and it doesn't seem to serve any purpose to prohibit somebody from being able to cultivate for personal use with a prescription in a commercial zone.
It's not for commercial purposes. It's just the zoning issue you're talking about, a
Yes.
location issue.
It's basically what it is it's recognizing the existing state law that allows people to have personal use of up to 100 square feet anywhere in the city now, and it's saying we don't want commercial cultivation in the city. That, to me, is the right motion.
Mr. Hotchkiss, will you?
Does the city attorney or does Mr. Casey, do you have a problem with that if we broaden that to private use, although somebody might live in a commercial zone?
I'll start. Madam Mayor, council members, I think there's some logic to that in that we do allow residential uses in a lot of our commercial zones except for the M1.
That's correct. Mr. Colon, do you have a problem with that?
Only with understanding it. And
I think what Mr. Hart means is if somebody lives in a CM2, they could also,
where
for medical
a
purposes,
commercial
grow.
property is actually occupied for residential use.
Yes.
Right.
Or Madam Mayor, yeah.
Not even a commercial property. There are
Correct.
residential properties in commercial zones. State Street
Where they're
is a
allowed.
great example.
Where they're allowed.
Well, maybe I'm not understanding. I was assuming you were referring to there are plenty of properties around town that are Zone C, but which are residentially occupied.
Yes.
Correct, and that would be
Yes.
allowed.
That's what you're
allowable.
referring to.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's part of the motion. I agree to that.
So the motion is up to 100 square feet for personal medical use anywhere where there's a residential property in the city.
Right, and I don't know if,
No commercial cultivation, no cultivation for commercial purposes. And I believe that's the motion. I believe that
correct.
gets to
Is that
all-
a second also?
And I second that, sure.
Okay.
Francisco seconds that. Okay, and Mr. Hart's okay with that, we think. Okay, Mr. White. It's
No, we're
only,
not.
if someone wants to ask a question, they can. Mr. White, did you have a, oh, Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And we've dispensed with the idea that there's going to be the 500 square foot collective. For that. I mean, we're fighting awfully hard to develop this 3 dispensary system, and we haven't gotten to the transport or delivery part yet. And yet we're going to want to grow it everywhere in town. So, and I realize that the personal use thing is already allowed under state law. But it just seems like we're fighting this awfully hard to create this amazing distribution system for a city of 90,000. I don't know how many morbidly ill people there are here that really need to access this, but it seems like everybody's in a lot of trouble here. So I guess,
I think what,
but I don't have a big problem with the
I
motions.
mean, I understand. I think we're in a situation, and just to get to, I think some of this is why you want to have more time to go through things, but we just don't have the luxury of time, so we need to have something. So we're going to have something that makes sense. And if a future council wants to amend it in the future, we have the time to do so. Mr. Kalan, I have a question. So there's a motion on the floor about this cultivation ordinance piece. You are also going to need a motion about direction regarding the other items today, correct? So
You mean the distribution?
transportation and,
Not necessarily.
all right, we just have direction to move forward with that? Okay. All right. And obviously, so if this motion passes, the process would be what? It goes just back to council as an ordinance
No, we'd need to have a planning commission hearing and then to council.
Okay, so there'll be other public, my point out there is there'll be at least 2 other public hearings on this item before anything is adopted. Okay.
Madam
All right.
Mayor?
Yes, Ms.
Brief
Maria.
question, if I might. Does that give us time to meet the state deadline as we want to maintain control?
I honestly don't know. We may have to come back with the urgency approach.
Emergency approach, right? We could still do that, though.
If we need to.
And there's a risk associated with that, but it's better than no action.
Mr.
Okay, Mr.
I'm sorry,
Dr.
Madam Mayor.
Behrens to the council. Ms. Murillo, go ahead.
Thank you. If we don't include the 500 square feet for the 5-person collective, we're going against the state law that's already established. Is that, can I ask legal counsel that question? Either Ms. Ostranger or Mr.
We have the state authority to regulate, use land use regulations, which is what we're doing, so we can be more restrictive than state law.
I mean, many cities
Not
have an
comfortable
outright
with
ban
that,
all over
yeah.
the place, so, okay. Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We would have time to schedule a council meeting. Let's just say the last piece is a council session to make final approval. We would have time to, and it's kind of consistent with what Mr. Hart is saying, to schedule that in the December time
If
frame.
we needed a special session, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, yes, that's what our staff report says. I was hedging my bets because I don't know the Planning Commission schedule, and we'll have to, I believe, publish notice for the Planning Commission to do a citywide zoning amendment. So there are some lead times that I can't swear to off the top of my head.
Okay. Thank you.
Francisco.
Thank you. Just to Mr. Rouse's point, I think what we want to accomplish here is make sure that we, as a city, maintain control. And by prohibiting any commercial cultivation, I think that is the main thing that we want to accomplish. So I think this is a reasonable approach.
And just to Ms. Murillo's point, I think personally I'd probably be a little more lenient, but I think in terms of a 5-vote requirement and a tight time frame, we need to start somewhere. And to me, retaining that local control option, that if we need to look at something in the future afterwards, we can still do so. So I don't want to lose the local control option because we don't have 5 votes for some other piece. And it seems like we do have general consensus on this piece, which I would not support an outright ban altogether. So I think we're getting there. Yes, Mr. White.
I want to say I agree with you. That's exactly. I would prefer to see the 5-person collective piece in there, but I'm good with it just for now as a temporary.
So we're counting to 3 that there's only 3 of us that would go for 500 square feet. We need 5, and we only have 3.
We don't know how. I know we don't have 5. Let me just put it that way. I know we don't have 5. So that's. I'm just trying to. It's just a practical way of under the restraints that we're having.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Can we repeat the final motion, please?
So the
Madam Mayor?
motion is to direct staff to come back with an ordinance about the cultivation, which would only allow it in the case of up to 100 square feet for personal medical use, and no cultivation for commercial purposes in areas that are residential, that are being used for residential purposes. Is that no? Okay. So
Madam Mayor, I have the 100 square feet for personal medical use, no commercial growing anywhere, residential only. Then there was an amendment that was accepted by the maker to allow in residentially occupied C or other zones.
That's what I meant. So that's what I meant to say. Okay. And more importantly, does the clerk have it? Okay, good. That's why we tape these things too. So understanding the motion? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. That's unanimous. Good luck with that. Wow. I know. That can happen. And you heard direction about your direction about the other items, so I think we're good with that, right?
Well-
Okay. Before you all stand up, we do have council member committee assignment reports and a closed session, right?
But wait.
Oh, we have a whole nother item. Okay, you want to take a mini break? Yeah, mini break. Really quick? All right, let's do item 21 very quickly.
Short-term residential rental subpoenas.
Okay, thank you. Aha, there we are. Thank you,
Afternoon,
Mr.
Madam
Jones.
Mayor, members of City Council. I'm just here briefly to inform you this matter's on the agenda for the purposes. On August 11th, you authorized our office to draft and the mayor to sign legislative subpoenas, which we served on websites that listed vacation rentals in the city. We sent right now to 4 websites, local websites that had at least 15 or more properties advertised. As of 2 o'clock today, 3 out of the 4 have responded. One hasn't provided us documents yet. So at that point, the one that has disobeyed the subpoena, we will look to file a motion to hold that legislative platform listing in contempt of court. And the next process now is to send out more legislative subpoenas to internet sites. Any questions?
Do we have any public comment speaker slips on this? No. Okay.
Can you name the 4 that have responded positively?
The 3 out of the 4?
Yeah, 3 out of 4, sorry.
Sure. Santa Barbara Vacation Rentals, Santa Barbara Exclusive Rentals, and Coastal Hideaways Incorporated.
So Paradise Retreats has not responded.
No, they have not. They have not at least provided documents to us yet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that was your question? Okay, there's no public comment speaker slips on this, so it's to the council. Is there comments or a motion?
I think at this point, we're
you just received it.
Yeah, we're just.
We don't need a motion.
Yeah, we're just waiting. The people who were subpoenaed had the opportunity either to mail us or send us the information or appear here today by 4 o'clock.
So we're receiving it, and thank you. You're right.
Thank
This was
you.
very quick.
Thank you
All right,
so much.
thank you very much. All right, council member committee assignment reports before we get to closed session. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. During the Gibraltar fire, I got to visit the command center as it was reestablished at Las Positas, at the Earl Warren Showground, I should say. And very, very, very impressed with the amount of coordination, the different agencies that were there working collectively in just almost a ballet-like way. It was incredible to watch, very efficient. Kudos to our guys.
Yeah,
and
kudos
gals.
to a whole lot of people.
Yeah.
Yep. Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I attended the Water Commission meeting yesterday. I won't go into the drought update material because we'll be getting that as we do monthly next week. Only kind of different pieces that Madeline Ward, whom we've gotten to know as the conservation representative for the city, conservation staff, has now been promoted to permanent water conservation coordinator for the city of Santa Barbara. So that's the good news that comes out of the Water Commission.
Great. Mr. Hart.
Last week, I attended the National League of Cities Conference, and there were a number of sessions discussing the disruptive technology platform industries that are coming up in the country. A lot of consternation, a lot of concern about vacation rentals and other of these industries that operate outside of local control and regulations. And it was interesting to hear the perspective of other communities around the country, and ironically, our concern and experience with the legislative subpoenas. Some of the major corporate efforts, entities are not the least bit interested in cooperating with information sharing about their business.
We are not alone. Yep. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our city attorney for attending a meeting of the homeless advocates who meet at Chuck Blitz's house once a month, and you gave us good information about law enforcement and our street people and the RV situation. Thank you. I attended the Community Action Commission board meeting last week. We approved our new budget. And the day after the election, I went to a Women in Leadership conference put on by the Santa Barbara County Commission for Women, Women's Economic Ventures. Yes, we are still trying to get more women in elected office. Thank you.
Okay, we have a closed session.
Conference with City Attorney, existing litigation. The pending litigation is Karen Fox versus City of Santa Barbara.
Thank you. With that, we will adjourn to Monday, November 16th, 2015 at 1:30 to 806 Alberta Avenue for a site visit regarding an appeal at that site. Thank you.
The music can dance.